I answered, that cannot much me grieve. A penny can do no more than it may. I drank a pint, and for it did pay. Yet sore a hungered from thence I yet went, and wanting money I could not speed. He ends by saying how he at last went to Billingsgate, and there tried to persuade a bargeman to row him across the river for nothing. But the bargeman declined to take any less than twopence, saying that he was not yet come to the time of life when he wished to practice active benevolence by the bestowal of alms. At last, the poet got safely into Kent, and made up his mind to have no more to do with lawyers. The whole concludes with a pious wish for the welfare of London and of all honest lawyers. Save London, and send true lawyers their meed. For whoso lacks money, with them shall not speed. The moral of the ballad is obvious. If you wish to go to law, you should go to London, and if you wish to go to London, you should first of all fill your purse. We want to get at the mind of the people. We have seen that the women at least did not read, and of book learning the London craftsmen had none. But they must have had ideas, subjects of conversation, current beliefs. What were they? Towards the end of the 14th and throughout the 15th century, there can be no doubt that there was everywhere a spirit of restlessness and questioning. The wandering preachers, Wycliffe's preachers, made the people compare the true religious life with the example of the religious life held out for them by the prelates and abbots with their splendid retinues and their pride, by the monks with their sloth, and by the friars with their greed and their licentiousness. Those who defend the church at this time are unwilling to admit either the pride of the former or the license of the latter. Let us, therefore, be content to mark what was said and taught, whether it was true or not, and to remember that these things were openly said and taught, and were believed by the people. One remembers what was said by a woman of London when a fire broke out at Willesden, and the image of the Virgin was partly burned. "How can she help me?" asked this shrewd questioner, "if she cannot help herself?" During this period of slow awakening, the people learned anew the lesson that religion was not a thing of rule and purchase, and that the profession of religion demanded a corresponding life of purity. To put on the Franciscan habit and to profess the Franciscan rule was not, it was discovered, in itself an act or a proof or an illustration of religion. The perception by the people of the great rule, the scholars had long since understood, prepared the way for the expression of free thought in the 16th century. Equally interesting it is to mark the revolt in the minds of the people against their rulers, and the mingling of the revolt against the church with the revolt against the nobles. John the Miller hath grown small, small. The king's son of heaven shall pay for all. Beware ere ye be woe. Know your friend from your foe. Haveth enough and saith, say ye, ho, stop. And do well and better and fleeth sin. And seeketh peace and hold therein. And so biddeth John Truman and all his fellows. John Ball, St. Mary Priest, greeteth well all manner of men, and biddeth them, in name of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, stand manlike together in truth, and help truth, and truth shall help you. Now reigneth pride in price, cowardice is holden wise, lechery without shame, gluttony without blame, ennui reigneth without reason. 284. And sloth is taken in great season. God do boot, for now is time, amen. And again, Percy Society. Jack Truman doeth you to understand that falseness and guile hath reigned too long, and truth hath been set under lock, and falseness reigneth in every flock. No man may come truth to, but he sing, si dedero. Speak, spend, and speed, quoth John of Bathon, and therefore sin fareth as wild a flood. True love is a way that is so good, and clerks for wealth worketh them woe. God do boot, for now is time, amen. My good friends, these were the words of John Ball of Canterbury, as reported by Froissart, and there were others who preached the same doctrine. Things cannot go on well in England, nor ever will, until everything shall be in common, when there shall neither be vassal nor lord, and all distinctions levelled, when the lords shall be no more masters than ourselves. Are we not all descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? He then goes on to contrast the lot of the lords with that of the people. We are called slaves, and if we do not perform our services we are beaten, and we have not any sovereign to whom we can complain, or who wishes to hear us and to do us justice. As regards the ideas of the people on government, we must remember that in London the old Saxon freedom was never lost. Londoners chose their mayor, aldermen and sheriffs, and appointed their own judges. Every freeman of the city of London, therefore, felt that he had part in the government of the city. As we have seen in the history of the city, there were dissensions and factions from time to time, but the one great principle that London was free to elect its own magistrates and to preserve its own form of government was never departed from. It was, therefore, not an imposed government, but a popular government of their own. There was never any question about obeying the government of London. There was never any popular rising against the government of London. It was natural, and it was proper that the aldermen should be the rulers, and if anyone had the temerity to strike an alderman or refuse to obey his ruling, it was just and proper to the people themselves for that man to have his hand struck off. And in the same way it was understood by everybody that in defense of the king, their overlord, it might be necessary to go forth and fight. Therefore, it was incumbent for everyone to learn the use of arms and to be possessed of certain weapons. In the inventories which we find of house furniture of the 14th century, there are always armor and arms. The craftsman, therefore, was a soldier, a freeman, 285, and an elector. Further, for the advantage of his own trade, he understood that it was important for him to combine and associate himself into a guild or company. He understood that he must be loyal to this company, that he must obey its officers, and that he must put in good work. Beggar importuning noble lady. From Ramont of the Rose in British Museum, Harl, Ms. 4425. The rebellion of Wat Tyler was encouraged by the people of London, according to Froissart, who repeats what he heard and clearly echoes the rumors prevalent at the court. The Londoners, he says, invited the country people to assemble and to march upon London, where they promised them a good reception, and such a welcome that there should soon be not a slave left in all England. But there were none in London. The people came up from all parts of the kingdom. They came in companies of 12 or 100. Froissart says they knew not what they wanted. It is, however, quite certain that they wanted to realize the dream of their preachers. They wanted, what people always want, justice. They wanted to see the life of religion instead of the profession of religion, and they knew very well what the life of religion meant. They wanted a more equitable division of the world's goods. The great rebellion of Wat Tyler, if it was really encouraged, welcomed, or invited by the common people of London, which I doubt, further than that there were certainly some who had imbibed the ideas of John Ball, shows us what the common people thought. As for the extent of their knowledge and its limitations, London was a place of foreign trade, and the center of internal trade. It was therefore filled with people carrying on the trade of distribution, collection, import, and export. In other words, it was constantly receiving and sending forth men to foreign countries across the sea and to all parts of the realm of England to carry on their trade. The boys went down to the quays to talk with the sailors and the stevedores. They learned to distinguish the Genoese and the Venetian galleys, the ships of the Hanseatic League, the ships from Lisbon and the ships from Bordeaux. They heard where these places were and what they sent to London. The voyagers themselves in the taverns told their travelers' tales. All that trade could teach the people was learned by them in the 14th century as well as in the 19th. I suppose that they would not be able to draw a mappamundi with much approach to accuracy, but they knew where places were. Their knowledge of geography and of peoples was widened also by their pilgrimages and by the stories told by pilgrims on their return. As to science, each man had the mastery of his craft. That was enough for him. As to history, the people of London remembered. No doubt they mixed up a good many events, but they remembered at least their own liberties. Of books they had none and could not read. Of songs satirical, historical, commemorative, they had of their own a good many which are still surviving. It will be understood from the foregoing what were the rough ideas of the people as to religion and social economy, how their knowledge of the world was considerable, how their trades taught them a certain amount of science, and how their popular songs extended and deepened and strengthened the popular ideas. In the chapter on sports and recreations, these matters are fully dealt with, but there are a few minor notes which do not exactly belong to these things and come more properly here under the heading of manners. On festive occasions the people wore garlands. The master and wardens of a company wore garlands on their great days. At banquets they wore garlands, ladies wore garlands, young ecclesiastics wore garlands. When anyone rode abroad not to battle, he hung little bells on the bridles and harness of his horse. Wycliffe speaks of a priest in pomp and pride, covetise and envy with fat whores and bridley's ringingby, by the way and himself in costly clothes and peller fur. In every wealthy household the falcon was as much of a domestic pet as the dog. The peregrine especially was easy to tame, mult courtois et valen et de bonne manière. very tame, bold, and of good manners. The clerk and the notary and the scrivener carried about with them a case containing paper, pens, ink, and other necessaries for writing, so that they could be called into a house or shop for the purpose of writing down anything. The writing case was called a penner. I have already said that every man was bound to keep ready for use arms or armor according to his degree. We must always bear in mind that the Londoner was a soldier first, whatever his calling. He was liable to be called out for the defense of the city, or even on occasion to march out into the country. Therefore every man had to learn, and to practice, the use of arms, such as shooting with the longbow, how to handle a pike, and how to use a sword. Thus, in the inventory of the furniture belonging to Hugh le Bever, whose case is quoted elsewhere, we find a hacketon, i.e. a jacket of quilted leather sometimes worn under armor, sometimes used as armor. In the reign of Henry Roman II, everyone who held a knight's fee was bound to have a habergeon or undercoat of mail, a helmet, a shield, and a lance. A freeholder of 16 marks must have the same. One of 10 marks must provide a small habergeon and a capeline of iron and a lance, while the ordinary burgher must at least have a capeline and a lance. Besides the wholesale merchants and the shopkeepers, there were the stationers. In every public place, wherever there was a church, or a cross, or a conduit, there were put up stations or stalls. Thus, in the year 1370, there were 11 stations round the High Cross of Cheap, let to as many women, at the annual rent of 13s. 4d. In that year the whole number were convicted of using false measures. The modern word stationer is derived from the practice of selling paper, pens, etc., at such stations. Among the fraternities of London must not be forgotten that called the Company of the Pewee, in honor of God, Our Lady St. Mary, and all saints both male and female, and in honor of our Lord the King and all the barons of this country. It has been suggested that the fraternity was named after Our Lady of La Paix in Auvergne, an image of the Black Virgin which worked miracles. There were many societies of the Pewee in France. This of London drew up for its own use and guidance a set of rules which are still existing and have been published in the Liber Customarum. It was, in fact, an early specimen of a club founded for purposes of peace, joyousness, harmony, and friendship. It was open to everybody, that is, to everybody whom the governing body chose to admit. There were no distinctions of nationality. There was an entrance fee and a subscription. The society was governed by a committee of 12 members, elected for life, and by a prince, who was elected every year. As no fraternity could exist without religion, a chaplain was maintained for the purpose of singing Mass every day, and for all the members, living or dead. The great day of the society was the first Sunday after Trinity, when a meeting was held in a hall newly strewn with rushes and decked with branches. On this day the prince for the year was invested. The old prince, with the crown of office on his head and a gilt cup full of wine in his hands, marched down the room singing. Then he gave the newly chosen prince the crown, offered him the cup, and hung up his arms over the presidential chair. This done, the meeting proceeded with the business of the day, which, like the famous annual festival at Toulouse, chiefly consisted in choosing and rewarding the best song. The competitors sat in a row on a seat covered with cloth of gold. The judges were the newly elected prince and the outgoing prince. Assisted by 15 jurymen, the competitors sang the songs to music of their own composition. When the prize was adjudged, the successful competitor was duly crowned. Then dinner was served, and after dinner they all rode in procession through the city, the two princes heading the cavalcade, followed by the poetic champion of the day. At the house of the new prince they all dismounted, and the brethren executed a dance in the street. The day after this great feast, Mass was sung at St. Helen's for the souls of the brotherhood. It is a pleasant glimpse of the sunnier side of the city life. The merchants unite once a year at least, English, French, and Germans, all alike in friendliness. They sing, they feast, they dance, they go to church, and they encourage each other, all together, in the practice of concord and harmony, brotherly help and brotherly love. The postage or carriage of letters was by no means neglected, and grew into a regular system by slow degrees. Edward Roman IV stationed men every 20 miles, whose duty it was to carry dispatches as fast as they could gallop for this distance, and to hand them on to the next man. Edward I had messengers who took charge of the dispatches of the officers of state, the constables of castles, and the sheriffs of counties. The messenger was paid at the rate of a shilling a day. Some tenants held their land on the condition of carrying the lord's letters. There was a regular mail sent off by the Venetians from London to Venice every month. It included the letters of the merchants of both cities. Private gentlemen also sent their servants to carry letters. In this way the Paston correspondence was carried on. If this correspondence be taken as an average example of the letter writing of the time, there must have been great need of an organized postal system. The internal trade was managed in the summer by means of long strings of pack horses. In the winter, there was very little traveling and no traffic. Probably messengers were sent about at least on the king's service, which could not be stopped all the winter, but the state of the roads forbade any but the most necessary traveling. Yet they were not so bad in the 14th century as they were in the 17th, 300 years later. Here are a few notes. It was customary after the arrest of criminals and disorderly persons, at the dragging of a man on a hurdle, or at the putting of a man in pillory, to precede the prisoner and his guards with music, trumpets, pipe, and tabor. The object, of course, was to call general attention to the culprit, and to increase the shame of his punishment. Lovers gave and exchanged a true love knot. Some of these knots had 4 loops, for which reason the herb paris, which had 4 leaves set against each other, was known as true love. A great feast was continued for 3 days, during which the company continued to eat, drink, sing, dance, and look on at games. It was a common practice with friends to take oaths of fraternity and friendship one with another, sometimes even to die for each other, if the occasion should demand this proof of friendship. Of reconstruction of the past there is no end, because something new, which was also old, is continually turning up. See, for instance, the cart covered with a black cloth on which is a white cross, slowly passing down the street. The horse carries a bell which tolls mournfully. The cart is led by a man in the livery of the Carthusian brothers. It contains the body of one who has died a violent death, killed in a brawl by some rioter unknown, killed in a mad fight over a woman. Who knows? They will take the cart to Pardon churchyard, where lie buried so many victims of the Black Death. The poor wretch will be laid, at least, in sacred soil. Or there is the procession of the sanctuary man who has abjured the kingdom. He is bareheaded and barefooted. He carries a wooden cross. He is led to the bridge gate by the sergeants of his ward. He has 3 days in which to reach Dover and to get across the seas. And after, history knows no more. Here is a crowd gathered round the woman set up in the shameful thew. Why is she set there? For tampering with her measures and defrauding her customers. The interests of beer are concerned. The crowd is justly indignant, words of reproach and contumely greet the culprit. She hides her face in terror and in shame. It seems a light thing to stand up for an hour or two before the people. It is anything but light, it is grievous, it is a lifelong disgrace. Women have been known to fall down dead in such a case, overwhelmed and heartbroken with the public exposure. Here comes one, a city officer, clad in a tunic ornamented with death's heads. The grinning skulls proclaim his office. He is the death crier. In his hand he carries a bell, which he rings as he walks along the streets. At night he carries a lantern. He might walk through the streets at any time of the day or night, for he announces the death of some great man. Good people, he cries, of your charity pray for the soul of our dear brother, who departed this life at such or such an hour. As he passes, perhaps in the dead of night, his voice awakens those who sleep. They arise, they open their windows, they put out their heads, and murmur a prayer. When the king died, it was the custom for the death crier to march through the streets escorted by the Guild of All Hallows carrying crosses. Other duties were imposed upon the officers in order to find work enough 290 for them to do. There was one, it seems, for every ward. They inspected taverns and reported to the aldermen on their conduct and management. They also watched for, and reported, houses of ill fame and places which harbored disorderly persons. Chaucer, in describing the miller, speaks of the Golaertes. The Golaertes was a professional diner-out, one who earned his dinner by telling tales, reciting verses, and making jests for the amusement of the company. The profession is one branch of the many devoted to making a sad world merry. The mime, the tumbler, the dancing girl, the juggler, the tomfool, the singer, the musician, and the diner-out are all members of this honorable and creditable profession. Professor Skeet has kindly sent me the following notes on medieval manners and customs, taken from a lecture delivered before the University Extension Conference in 1898. In 1 or 2 places, they mention matters already recited by myself. The greater part of the notes, however, will be found to supplement my own. But the field of medieval manners is absolutely inexhaustible. I would recommend the reader to look through the learned professor's notes to Chaucer and Piers Plowman for an illustration of the axiom. It was usual, he remarks, for tradesmen's apprentices to stand at the shop doors, touting for custom by means of incessant shouting. At the door of the cook who provided meat and drink for the hungry wayfarer was heard the cry, "Hote pies, hote, i.e. hot pies all hot," or else, "Good gries and geese, i.e. good roast pigs, good roast geese," or "Gow dine, gow, i.e. let's go and dine." At the door of the taverner was heard the cry, "White wine of Gascony, i.e. white wine of Alsace, red wine of Gascony," or else, Wine of the Rhine, i.e. wine of the Rhine, or wine of Rochelle, i.e. wine of Rochelle, and these wines were especially warranted to assist the digestion, as being the correct drink to take after dining off roast meat. One common use of bread was to feed horses and dogs with. I have often seen a horse eat a loaf of bread in Switzerland, but never in London, so I suppose it is not now in use here. One common name for a horse was Bayard, and hence a horse loaf was sometimes called a Bayard's bun. In the same way, I may here note that there was once a place in London called Bayard's Water, i.e. a watering place for horses. It is now called Bayswater. It deserves to be mentioned that there was a kind of ale particularly known by the name of London ale. As early as the time of Henry Roman III, London had established a special reputation for its ale, which was considered by good judges of drink as being of the first quality. There is a particular allusion to it in Chaucer's description of the cook. The cook, it seems, was a good judge of liquor, hence it is said of him, well could he know a draught of London ale. One of the most noticeable and obvious characteristics of Old London was 291, the use of tradesmen's signs. At the present day, we seldom see signs hung out before any houses, except inns and taverns. But it was formerly usual for nearly every trade to exhibit a sign, and their great multitude added considerably to the picturesque effect of nearly every street. They were extremely conspicuous, being intended, of course, for advertisements and varied greatly. Sometimes they were stuck up on posts, but these were in the way of the passengers, so it was more usual to hang them out above the door, supported by poles or ornamental ironwork, or, if the street was unusually narrow, they were slung across the road. It is capable of proof that it is from this custom that the phrase to hang out originated. Do you hang out is now a colloquial phrase for where do you live, but the fuller expression, where do you hang out your sign, could once have been asked in all seriousness and would have been understood in the same sense. Examples are given in the New English Dictionary and in the Century Dictionary. There are still a few survivals of the old custom. Thus it was common for a dealer in woolen articles to hang out the golden fleece, and the golden fleece may still be seen before shops of this description. Another sign is well known as the barber's pole. These signs were so numerous, so cumbersome, and in a high wind so dangerous that they sometimes had to be suppressed, and we meet with enactments that attempted to regulate their size. The most objectionable were the ale stakes of taverns. An ale stake was a horizontal pole, projecting far in front of a tavern, sometimes bearing a sign, and almost invariably ornamented with a bunch of leaves suspended from its extremity. This bunch was called a bush, and gave rise to the proverb that good wine needs no bush, i.e. no advertisement. We find the following ordinance in the Liber Albus. Whereas the ale stakes, projecting in front of taverns in East Cheap, and elsewhere in the said city, extend too far over the king's highways, to the impeding of riders and others, and by reason of their excessive weight to the great deterioration of the houses in which they are fixed, it is enjoined that no one in future shall have a stake, bearing either his sign or leaves, i.e., or a bush, extending over the king's highway, of greater length than 7 feet at most. 7 feet is rather a large allowance, and affords some notion of the lengths to which these ale stakes had grown. There is one famous passage in Langland, which reminds us of Shakespeare's description of the Boar's Head Tavern in East Cheap, where Sir John Falstaff was wont to take his ease in his inn. It is a description of the company assembled in a large tavern in Cheapside or thereabouts, a company of a very miscellaneous sort. The chief person there is called Sir Glutton, who seems to have been just such another as Sir John Falstaff. This Sir Glutton was on his way to church on a certain Friday, in order to make confession, but he just 292 called in at the tavern as he went along. For it so happened that Baton the Brewster was standing at the tavern door, and took occasion to mention that she had some especially good ale for immediate consumption. "But have you," said he, "any hot spices to put in it?" "Yes," said she, "there's pepper and peony seeds and a pound of garlic and a farthing's worth of fennel seed, especially reserved for Fridays." That was just too much for him. In went Sir Glutton, and it is remarked, great oaths went with him. We are then introduced to the company, which included Cis the sempstress, Wat the gamekeeper and his wife, who was already drunk, Tom the tinker and 2 of his boys, Hick the horse dealer, Hugh the needle seller, Clarice of Cock Lane, and the clerk of the church, which probably alludes to St. Peter's Cornhill, a certain Sir Piers, a Flemish woman named Parnell, once a common female name, a Hayward or Hedgewarden, a hermit, the hangman of Tyburn, Daw the diker, i.e. hedger and ditcher, and a dozen rascals more, made up of porters and pickpockets and drawers of teeth. Then there were a minstrel and a rat catcher, and Rose the seller of dishes, Godfrey who sold garlic, and a Welshman named Griffin, and to conclude all, a heap of upholsterers or dealers in ready-made furniture. Then the whole company looked on while Hick the horse dealer and Clement the cobbler played at a kind of game called the New Fair, which was really a kind of bartering by handicap and constituted a mild form of gambling. The idea was simple enough, though it led to a large amount of dispute and wrangling before it could be satisfactorily settled. First of all, Clement the cobbler took off his cloak and laid it on a table or chair. Then Hick took off his hood and laid it beside the cloak. Then the whole business was to appraise the relative worth of the articles, which they wholly failed to do, till they appointed an umpire, viz., Robin the rope maker. Robin's decision was very advantageous to the taverner. It was clear that the cloak was worth more than the hood, so that some compensation was due to Clement, who accepted the hood in exchange. So he was allowed to fill up his cup at Hick's expense. And it was further provided that, if either of the parties was dissatisfied with the award, he was to be fined in a gallon of ale, out of which gallon he was to drink the health of Sir Glutton, who had been so good as to preside over the matter in dispute. And so things went on, till everyone grew more or less uproarious. And we are not surprised to hear that when Sir Glutton at last rose up, late in the evening, too late to go to church, he had already consumed about a gallon and a gill over, and, in crossing the floor, he went no straighter than a blind man's dog, which is sometimes in front and sometimes behind. He had much difficulty in finding the door and finally stumbled over the threshold, unable to rise, and at last, Clement and others had to carry him home. Then, with all the trouble in the world, his wife and his maid got him safely into bed, and there he slept all Saturday and all 293 Sunday, waking up at last on the Sunday evening. And as soon as ever he unclosed his eyes, the first word that he said was, "Where stands the bowl?" It is some satisfaction to know that his wife administered to him a severe rebuke, and that he was thoroughly ashamed of himself, and promised to observe Friday, thenceforward, as a day of abstinence and church-going. From this, it would appear that the manner of life as conducted inside a tavern was not very different from what it is now. One of the most curious points in Langland's description of this company is his inclusion of the hangman of Tyburn. Perhaps it is not generally known that there were, in fact, two Tyburns. The more celebrated one is that which took its name from the bourne or stream that was formerly called Tyburn. The exact spot where the gallows stood was not always precisely the same, but one position of it is denoted by a mark near the junction of Edgware Road with Oxford Street, not far from the Marble Arch. But there was another place of execution in Southwark, close to the St. Thomas A. Waterings mentioned by Chaucer in his famous prologue, and this place was expressly called Tyburn of Kent to prevent mistakes. In one passage, Langland alludes to what was then known as the benefit of clergy. This is a phrase which I strongly suspect has frequently been misunderstood. At any rate, to the modern ear, it is extremely misleading. It sounds as if it meant that the attendance of a clergyman might benefit the condemned criminal, but it means nothing of the kind. The word clergy had formerly two distinct meanings, or, strictly speaking, there were two distinct words which came to be sounded alike. One of these, referring to the clerical order, is still in common use. The other, meaning clerkship, scholarship, or learning, is practically obsolete. In old law, it meant ability to read, and at a time when such ability was uncommon, it was permissible, in the case of some misdeeds, that the criminal should claim his privilege of scholarship, if it was his first offense. If he could prove his ability to read, he could claim exemption from capital punishment. The person who examined the criminal, perhaps we may call him the examiner, usually selected one of the Latin psalms as the subject. Very often it was the 51st psalm beginning with the words Miserere me, Deus, or sometimes he pointed to the 5th verse of the 16th psalm, Dominus pars hereditatis me. It is to be suspected that some of the thieves carefully learned these Latin verses by heart before they stole a purse, a practice of which we never hear at the present day. Langland's praise of the benefits of a good education is surely remarkable, and such as we are by no means accustomed to. Well may the child bless the man who set him to learn books. Familiarity with literature has often saved a man, body and soul. Dominus pars hereditatis me is a pleasant verse. It has been known to save from Tyburn some 20 strong thieves. When ignorant thieves are made to dangle, just see how the learned ones are saved. Chapter 9. Food. London has always been a city renowned for the great plenty and excellence of its food. In the 12th century, Fitz-Stephen vaunts the cookshops. He says, "There is also in London on the bank of the river, amongst the wine shops which are kept in shops and cellars, a public eating house. There are to be found, according to the season, every day, dishes of meat, roast, fried and boiled, great and small fish, coarser meats for the poor, more delicate for the rich, of game, fowls, and small birds." These cookshops were principally stationed in Thames Street and East Cheap. The Londoner had 2 meals a day. For the nobility, dinner at 11 and supper at 5. For the merchants, dinner at 12, supper at 6. Cookery books in manuscript have come down to us from the 14th century, and a great many menus of feasts have been preserved. So it is quite easy to understand how the king and the great lords lived, but it is not so easy to understand the ordinary fare of the well-to-do citizen and the craftsman. Before presenting the menu, let us speak of certain dinner customs. The tables were movable. They were laid on trestles. They were covered with white cloths. Before every man was a wooden platter or a roundel. The roundel was a circular wooden platter, one side of which was covered with a black ground, on which were inscribed certain verses in gilt letters within a circle formed by a broad band of white and a narrow band of gold. In the inner circle was a figure of some kind, and generally each roundel was one of a series representing a group of figures. Thus in Archaeology, Vol. Roman 34, may be found the figures and verses of 9 such roundels out of a set of 12. They belong to the time of Elizabeth or James I, that is to say, later than that we are now considering. Each figure represents some calling or trade. Thus there are the courtier, the divine, the soldier, the lawyer, the merchant, the gentleman, the bachelor, the wife, the widow, 9 in all. 3 are lost. It is suggested that these platters were used for fruit. But surely fruit would speedily have stained the figures. May they not have been intended for bread, which would not spoil a trencher? But it is possible also that they were only used for ornaments. For the king or for any great lord there was the taster, to prevent the danger of poison, and the fool or jester sat or stood near the king and made him laugh, a feat, at times, of considerable difficulty. As for the provisions at the banquet, here are 2 menus, both of the 14th century. They belong to great feasts, the kind of feast which would last for perhaps 3 days. First course: browet farced and charlotte for pottage. Baked mallard, teals, small birds, almond milk served with them. Capon roasted with the syrup. Roasted veal, pig roasted endured and served with the yolk on his neck over gilt. Herons. A lech, a tart of flesh. Second course: browet of almond and viand real for pottage. Mallard, roasted rabbits, pheasant, venison. Jelly, a lech, urchins, hedgehogs. Pomme d'orange. Third course: boar in eggerdaus and maumine for pottage. Cranes, kid, curlew, partridge, all roasted. A lech, a custard. A peacock endured and roasted and served with the skin. Cockagris, flompants, darioles. Pears in syrup. First course: brawn with mustard, cabbages in pottage, swan standard, canaille roasted, great custards. Second course: venison in broth with white matrues, canaille standard, partridges with cocks roasted, lech lombard, dowsets with little parnu. Third course: pears in syrup, great birds with little ones together, fritters, pain puff with a cold bake meat. A few notes are necessary to elucidate the above menu. Browet was a soup or broth made from boiled meat. Cockagris was a peculiar dish consisting of an old cock and a pig cooked together. Dowsets were sweet dishes. Flompants were ornamented tarts. And to endure anything was to glaze it with yolk of egg. Ed. It will be remarked that there is no mention here of plain beef or mutton. These did not belong to a feast. They are, however, mentioned in plainer bills of fare. The endeavor of the cook was to serve made dishes highly seasoned and spiced. Wright, for instance, explains some of the receipts by which it will be seen that our forefathers were luxurious in their food, if not gross. Everything also points to the fact that they were very large eaters. The open-air life led by the better class, the riding and exercise, the very scanty use of vegetables, all these contributed to make them ready for the trencher. At every course of a great banquet the cook sent up a subtlety, which was 296 a composition in pastry, the last survival of which was the ornamental castle in sponge cake, which used to occupy the middle of the table at a dinner party. These subtleties were sometimes elaborate and artistic groups with figures of animals, such as a boar, hart, or sheep. In John Russell's Book of Nurture are presented several subtleties. Thus at his dinner of flesh for the first course. And then a sodelt. Maidon Mary that Holy Virgin. And Gabriel Grettinger with an Ave. For the second course, a sodelt following in fear. The course for to fulfill. An angel goodly can appear. And singing with a murray cheer. Unto eage shepherds up in an hill. And for the third course, sodelt's full solemn. That lady that consued by the Holy Ghost. Him that destroyed the fens boost. Presented pleasantly by the kings of Colon. 8. Chaucer alludes to the extravagances of sodalts in the Parson's Tale. Pride of the table apereth eke full oft. For certes, rich men benny cleaped in feasts and poor folk ben put away and rebuked. Also in excess of divers meats and drinks, and namely such manner bake meats and dish meats. Brennenge of wilda for and painted and castellated with papier and scribblable wast, so that it is abusive for to think. Banquet in London, Temp, Edward Roman 4. From Ms. in British Museum, Royal E4. The people of medieval times loved everything to be sweet, as is shown above in their pouring a sweet sauce over their birds and honey over their meat. They also sweetened their wine. Each course, which consisted of 3 or more dishes for an ordinary dinner, was a dinner in itself, containing fish, flesh, fowl, and sweets. For instance, at a certain dinner there were 2 courses only, but of 8 or 9 dishes to each course. Thus we have in the first course, lamprey, codling, shoulder of mutton, chicken, wild goose, wood dove, wurts, vegetable, and tortoise in paste. In the second we have eels, sea horse, lamb, mallard, quail, goldfinch, and pinund, but there was an interval between each course. As we shall see immediately, table manners were carefully taught and insisted upon. One curious regulation was that cooks were forbidden to go out of the city in order to meet victuals coming in, so that they might get them more cheaply than in the open market. The mayor also took account of the deceitful ways of certain pastelers or pea-bakers, who dared to put giblets and rabbits into their pies, and to sell beef pies for venison pies. And the sale of meat that was putrid was punished by pillory, while the meat itself was burned under the offender's nose. The great 297 city merchant fed as well as the king, and sometimes entertained the king quite royally. The humbler man, the well-to-do burgher, and even the craftsman, there is every reason to believe, fared well and plentifully. They lived on beef and mutton, meat pies, pork, capons, wild birds, and sea fish. The wild birds were brought up in great quantities from the counties of Essex and Suffolk. There was a plentiful supply of fish. From all the country round along every track that they called a highway down the rivers, the Thames, the Brent, the Wandle, the Fleet, the Lee, the Ravensbourne, came boats and barges laden with farm produce. The city was well supplied, and there was seldom any dearth. As for the food of the middle classes, the better sort, was not the company at the Tabard chiefly composed of the middle class? Among them was the cook. What did he cook for them? A cook they had with them for the nones, to boil the chicken and the marrow bones, and powder marchant tart and gallingale. Well could he know a draught of London ale. He could roast and seethe and broil and fry, maken mortrews and well bake a pie. For blank manger that made he with the best. Blank manger is a compound of capon minced, with rice, milk, sugar, and almonds. Powder marchant tart is a sharp kind of flavoring powder stewed with meat. Gallingale is the root of the sweet cypress, now no longer used. It is said to have an aromatic smell and a hot, biting taste. Of mortrews there were 2 kinds, mortrews de char and mortrews of fish. The first was a kind of soup in which chicken, fresh pork, bread crumbs, yolks of eggs, and saffron formed the chief ingredients. The second kind was a soup containing the roe, or milt, and liver of fish, bread, pepper, and ale. The ingredients were first braised in a mortar, whence their name. Skeet notes to Canterbury Tales. For a mixed company which contained, all together, craftsmen, retailers, merchants, sailors, ecclesiastics, squires, and knights, the kind of food here indicated is generous, at least. If, however, we study the list of creatures killed for one of the huge feasts, in which the people took delight, we arrive at a clearer understanding of the kind of food that could be bought by those who could afford it. Of animals we find wild bulls, oxen, sheep, calves, swine, kids, stags, bucks, and does. Of birds there are plover, quail, reese, query, ruffs, and reeves, peacock, mallard, swan, teal, crane, chicken, pigeon, bittern, heron, pheasant, partridge, woodcock, curlew, egret. Of fish, pike, bream, porpoise, seal. Jellies, tarts, custards, and sugared spices sweetened the magnificent feast. In the account of another meal which took place on a fast day, we find the following: of fish: ling, cod, salmon, fresh and 298 salted, white herring, red herring, sturgeon, eel, salt and fresh, whelk, pike, tench, carp, bream, lamprey, fresh and salt, conger, roach, seal, and porpoise. And in other menus we find entries of magpie, rook, jackdaw, thrush, starling, linnet, sparrow, heathcock, cormorant, sheldrake, wildfowl, lark. The crane plays a considerable part in medieval feasting. On one occasion when ambassadors arrived from France, the city gave them, among other things, 12 cranes and 12 pheasants. At the enthronization feast of the Archbishop of York, 6 ed. Roman 4. There were provided 204 cranes, 204 bitterns, and 400 heronshaws, at a feast of Richard Roman II. We find the following as the second course. Pottage. Pig is roasted. Cranes roasted. Pheasants roasted. Hearn roasted. Cranes lived in damp and marshy places, as did also egrets, a kind of heron. The country was covered with such places, so that they were doubtless common. Since 204 cranes could have been trapped or caught or shot with bow or with sling, for a single feast they must have been quite common. In a word, the people trapped, killed, and devoured all birds great and small. Hares and rabbits, of course, were served at table, and perhaps, no less daintily, the squirrel and hedgehog. Of vegetables and herbs there was a considerable variety, such as garlic, sage, parsley, dittany, wild thyme, onions, leeks, beans, peas, etc. The table, generally laid on trestles, was spread with a white cloth, the cleanliness of which was a matter of pride. The dinner scenes presented in MSS. Of the time show a service of a very simple character. The royal or noble party are seated upon what appears to be a bench without a back. Minstrels made music during the feast, especially between the courses. Jugglers, acrobats, or dancers performed after dinner. The principal ornament of the table was the nef, a silver vessel in the form of a ship which stood before the king or lord, and contained the salt and the king's towel. The meat, carved by a carver at a side table, was laid upon thick slices of bread which received the gravy. Each guest brought his own knife. Before and after dinner every one washed their hands. The ale and wine went round in horns and drinking cups. Every guest had his napkin, the conduct of which is carefully laid down in the babe's book. The floor was spread with rushes, which were by no means too clean or fresh. The old custom of laying straw in coaches and omnibuses may remind us of such a carpet. When the guest had done with the bones, he threw them on the floor for the dogs, if they chose. He did the same with the uneaten scraps. As for forks, there were none. Edward I, it is recorded, possessed one. Gaveston luxuriously ate pears with the help of a fork $2.99, he had 4. The Duke of Burgundy at the same time had 1. During dinner, the minstrels played in the gallery. It has been stated that bread was used for plates. The word trencher is derived from this custom. It was not the best bread that was so used, but a second quality baked for the purpose. The loaf was first pared to get rid of the crusts, and then cut into tranqueres or trenchers, i.e. into thick slices. The parings went into the alms dish. Thus Boke of Courtesy, edited by F. J. Furnival, the almoner said grace. The almoner by this hath said grace. And the alm is dished hath set in place. Therein the carver a loaf shall set. To serve God feast withouten let. These other loafs he parries about. Lays hit mid dish withouten doubt. They were dainty in the matter of bread. The commoner kinds were known as tourt, his, or treat and white. The finer kinds were simnel, painman, or pain de main, i.e. panis domini, from the figure of our Lord stamped upon it, and manchet. The finer kinds were not allowed to be made in Lent. The kinds called poof and franchise seem to have been the same as the simnel and the manchet. The bread of the working classes was of oats, of rye, of beans and bran, or of beans and acorns. Among river fish and fish of ponds or stews, carp was extremely scarce. Dame Juliana Berners, in her book of St. Albans, says, and of the carp that it is a daintest fish, but there ben but few in England. It is said to have been naturalized by one Leonard Maskell in Sussex about the year 1514. Hops and turkeys, carp and beer came into England all in a year. This is not true so far as the hop is concerned, for it seems to have been introduced by Edward I. Wine was made in England down to the 15th century. The Vale of Gloucester produced the finest wine, which was said to be in no way inferior to the wine of Gascony. Richard Roman II planted vines at Windsor and made a large quantity of wine, some of which was sold, and the rest used by the court. The reason why this industry fell into disuse was the discovery that wine could be imported from Bordeaux cheaper and better than it could be made at home. London has always been well supplied with taverns and drinking places. Its people have never taken kindly to ways of temperance. We must, however, distinguish between an inn and a tavern. At first the inn, hostelry, was a lodging house only. It received the traveler and gave him a room, but not much else. And, as we have seen, after one day and night the hosteler must become responsible for his guest, unless he could get special license from the authorities. The visitor was not allowed to carry a sword or any weapon, or to wear armor in 300 the city boundaries, and he must not go about the streets after curfew. Also, he must buy his food, bread and beer and meat and wine from the dealer, and not from the hosteler. When the inn became a house that supplied food and drink to the guest I know not, yet in Stowe's time it would seem that it did so. The point to remember, however, is that the inn was not a tavern or an eating house. Of taverns Stowe mentions some, as the Pope's Head and the Cardinal's Hat in Cornhill Ward, certain tippling houses in Mount Goddard Street and others. The alehouse and the tavern which proclaimed their trade by the ale stake had often the extra adornment of a garland or hoop. The garland was decorated with ribbons and was attached to the ale stake with the bush of ivy leaves which dangled from the pole before every tavern. We have seen what is said in Liber Albus as to the regulation length of the pole. The signs of the taverns were not at first different from other trade signs. There were the swan, the bull, the dog, the boar's head, and so forth. But this practice of hanging out a garland in addition to the old sign caused the names of tavern signs to undergo change. Thus, the swan became the swan on the hoop. The star became the star on the hoop. Riley enumerates many of these signs. Thus Hugh at a cock, Thomas at a red door, Walter at a goat, John at a bell, the cat fithel cat and fiddle, the lion at a door, le sunner, le moan, and others. For drink, the common and national drink was ale, of which the people consumed immense quantities. It seems to have been served out to any member of the household in any reasonable quantity whenever he asked for it. Of course, there were no hot drinks such as tea and coffee, although herbs were often infused with hot water for medicine. The principal wines were red wine from Bordeaux, white wine from Bordeaux, also from the Rhine, strong wine from Spain, Portugal, Tuscany, Sicily, Cyprus, Gaza. There were also cider, perry, mead, and strong ale, anything but water, and many drinks were compounded. Thus the people made clare, braggot, hippocras, the receipts for which are given in Skeats Chaucer. Thus to make clare, take a gallon of honey and scone, skim it well, and look when it is isod and boiled, that there be a gallon. Then take Roman 8 gallons of red wine, then take a pound of powder cannel, cinnamon, and half a pound of powder ginger, and a quarter of a pound of powder pepper, and metal mix. Alle these thinges together and with the wine, and do him in a clean burrell, and stop it fast, and roll it well off sides, as men don various 3 days. In the 15th century, home-brewed beer cost 112d. A gallon. Since beer is now 16d. A gallon, the inference would be that money then could buy 13 times as much as at present. But this inference, as I shall show presently, would not be sound. Wine cost 8d, or 12d. A gallon. Good wine can hardly be had now under 301.15s. A gallon or 30s, a dozen. It would not, however, be fair to conclude that money then would buy 20 times as much as it does now. A banquet. From Strutt's Manners and Customs. In considering the food of the people, we must be reminded that a large part of every year consisted of those days on which neither meat, eggs, butter, nor milk could be eaten, and only one meal a day was to be taken, and of those days on which meat was forbidden. There were 110 days in the year, nearly 1 in 3, on which a strict churchman would not eat meat, and of these there were more than 60 days on which he was allowed only one meal a day, and that without meat, butter, eggs, or milk. It is not to be supposed that the great mass of the people obeyed so rigid a rule. The work of the world, at least in the case of everything that demands activity of brain or strength of arm, would come to an end. Such a rule is only for a company of monks, but it is very certain that Lent and Fridays were observed with the greatest strictness so far as concerned abstinence from meat. No butchers' stalls were opened. No cooks' shops served meat to their customers. Dispensations and indulgences were granted, but the broad fact remains that in Lent and on Fridays no meat could be bought or sold, and none was used. Fish was thus a very important constituent in the food supply, and the price of fish, which the companies for the most part regulated by themselves for their own profit, was continually the subject of complaint and even of riots. Leprosy, it was commonly held, was caused by eating salted fish after it had become putrid or tainted. The following sorts of fish were salted: cod, salmon, conger, ling, brake, sturgeon, herring, pilchard, sprats, and eels, while perch, tench, bream, grayling, eels, and trout were caught for food. Carp and pike were considered delicacies. The great houses had fish ponds or stews. See, fish were baked in pies to enable them to be carried inland. See also London in the time of the Tudors, pp. 127-152. There were many markets for food in London. The names of most of them have been preserved by the name of the street. Of the instances in the case of the streets running out of cheap, we have already spoken. Certain commodities are still associated with certain localities. Fish has always been sold at Billingsgate, cattle and horses at Smithfield, and butchers' meat in Newgate Street. The great market on the south side of Cheap was given up to mercers, tailors, drapers, armorers, saddlers, all trades unconnected with food. The food of the country people, according to Piers Plowman, consisted almost entirely of vegetable produce. I have no money, says Piers, to buy pullets, geese, or pigs. He had 2 green cheeses, a few curds and cream, an oat cake, and 2 loaves of beans and bran for the children. He says that he has no salt bacon, but he has parsley, leeks, and cabbages. The peasants ate besides peascods, beans, leeks, onions, chervils, and such fruit as grew wild, but they had no meat or fish, wheaten or barley bread, no wine or beer. This was in the country where life was truly grievous. In the town, according to the same authority, there was a very different scene. Here, among the crowd of craftsmen of all kinds, cooks and their valets cried out all day, "Hot pies, hot, good pigs and geese, come and dine," while the taverner bawled, "White wine of Alsace, red wine of Gascony, wine of the Rhine, wine of Rochelle." And he paints a tavern scene at which Clement, the cobbler, sells his cloak, and Hick, the hackney man, his hood, and they spend the money in drink. Sis the shoemaker sat on the bench, Wat the warner and his wife also, Tim the tinker and 2 of his prentices, Hick the hackney man and Hugh the needle seller, Clarice of Cock Lane and the clerk of the church, Daw the ditcher and a dozen others, Sir Piers of Pretty and Pernel of Flanders, a fiddle player, a ratter, a sweeper of Cheap, a rope maker, a riding man, and Rose the dishmaker, Godfrey of Garlichithe and Griffin the Welshman, and many old clothesmen. In 1412, Henry instructed the mayor to obtain a return of the land and tenements held in the city and suburbs for purposes of taxation. The return professed to be incomplete, but the details, see Sharp's London and the Kingdom, are instructive. The gross rental of London was set down at £4,120, that of the mayor and corporation at £150. 9. 11. The bridge estate was worth £148. 15. 3. Private property in the city showed that Robert Chichell, the mayor, owned houses returning £42. 19. 2. And Whittington owned houses returning £25. Of course, this rental in no way represents the whole property of either. Attempts have been made to use old rentals in order to ascertain the comparative value of money. It is, however, an absolute impossibility to estimate in this, or in any other way, the true value of money at any date. It is almost waste of time to attempt any comparison with the present day, unless we know, which we can never learn, the standards of comfort and the way of life in every rank and every class. For instance, as we have seen, a noble lord who owned hundreds of manors kept up a great state with a huge following who lived upon him. He neither saved money nor tried to save money. His estates produced an income regular and large. He spent all. What was over was given in charity or to the church. He emptied his coffers as fast as they were replenished. The merchant, who lived in luxury, had to save because his way of life was precarious. The retailer, for the same reason, the uncertainty of trade, was compelled by the ordinary rules of prudence to live within his income. The craftsman, on the other hand, was like the noble lord in one respect, that he never saw or felt the necessity of saving money. He was always, as he is still, removed from starvation by 1 week's wages. The position, the wages of the craftsman can only, therefore, be understood if we know how he was accustomed to live, and how he wished to live, the amount of meat, bread, and beer he consumed. Then, again, the prices which are quoted are always those of regulation. When provisions began to be dear, the mayor and aldermen made laws as to the market price. They returned again and again to this method. When, as sometimes happened, the high prices were caused by the greed of traders, or by any kind of combination, this method answered very well. For instance, there were continual complaints of the fishmongers' exorbitant charges. Perhaps they were not really exorbitant, but at any rate regulations were passed, accordingly, ordering the price of fish. These regulations answered roughly for a little while, and were then forgotten and disregarded. What was the use of ordering the fishmonger to sell his best smelts at a penny the hundred, if the supply were limited and the demand excessive? The right of the mayor and aldermen to regulate the price at 3 or 4, which anything was to be sold, was never questioned. But, like many other medieval rights, it could never be enforced for lack of a police. In the year 1300, for instance, without any apparent pressure of scarcity, the mayor issued regulations as to the price of all provisions, but those for birds alone are preserved. Again, it helps one very little or not at all in the estimate of money and its value to know the market price of things, unless we know also whether the said commodities were at the time necessaries or luxuries, whether they were abundant or scarce. Thus a pheasant was to be sold at 4d. Who bought pheasants? Were they scarce or plentiful? Again, the following table drawn up by Dugdale is often quoted to show the purchasing power of money in the year 1300. A quarter of wheat 4s. A quarter of ground malt 3s, 4d. A quarter of peas 2s, 4d. A bull 7s, 6d. A cow 6s. A fat mutton ones, a new sheep zeros 8d, a capon zeros 2d, a cock or hen zeros 112d. We know that a quarter of wheat costs at the present moment so much, and we may, if we please, compare modern prices with medieval prices of wheat, but that helps us little because we all eat wheat bread now, and formerly the common people did not. The value of money must depend, not on prices alone, but as I have said, also on the standard of living, on wages, on hours of work, on the cost of things, on plenty and scarcity, on taxation, and on many other considerations. Thus, in the year 1314, corn being scarce, and provisions dear, the king, with the consent of his parliament, fixed the price of provisions. Comparing the king's prices of 1314 with the Lord Mayor S of 1300, it is plain that scarcity had raised the price considerably. If any person, says the proclamation, will not sell the saleable things for the price appointed as hereinbefore set forth, then the said saleable thing shall remain forfeited to us. And we will that the aforesaid ordinances from this time be firmly and inviolably observed in our said city, so that the Parliament of the year 1314 actually believed that they could fix the prices of provisions, so that they should remain fixed. That an attempt was made seriously to carry out this law is apparent from a brief of 2 years after, in which the king says, referring to the unlucky law of 1,314,305, because we have understood that such a proclamation, which at that time we believed would be to the profit of the people of our realm, redounds to their greater damage than profit. We command you that in the said several places ye cause publicly to be proclaimed that oxen, cows, sheep, hogs, geese, capons, hens, chickens, young pigeons, and eggs be sold for a reasonable price as was accustomed to be done before the said former proclamation. The knowledge of what was commonly paid for rent is some help towards understanding the value of money, but not much. There must be left over and above the rent, for the tenant, enough for him and his family to live upon. We are also helped by the endowments of chantries. A chantry priest was expected to live upon an endowment varying generally from £5 to £7 a year. The priest was an able-bodied man, raised above the lowest class, to which he often belonged by birth, and he looked for a certain standard of comfort. He had to live, say, on £6 a year, which is about 4d a week or 4d a day. It may also be noted that a young woman of the better sort was supposed to cost 8d a week for her board. Comparing this allowance with the prices ordered by the mayor at any time within 200 years, it will be found that a man could live very well on 4d a day. This would go a long way when a whole sheep cost a shilling and a quarter of wheat fours. If we suppose that a craftsman lived at 2/3 the cost of a priest, and that he had a wife and 4 children, we obtain the following estimate. The craftsman per annum £400, his wife £200, his 4 children £400, £1000. He would, therefore, want a wage of 4 shillings a week or 8d a day. Now the wages given to the workmen at St. Stephen's Chapel in 1358 are preserved in the account rolls of Edward Roman III. Some of them, enough for our purpose, are extracted in Britton and Bailey's History of Westminster Palace, p. 174. The wages varied. 18p a day was paid to Master Edmund Cannon, stonecutter, 1 shilling a day to Hugh the painter, 10d, a day to C. Pocrick, 8d, a day to W. Lincoln and W. Somerville, 6d, a day to W. Heston, 412d, and even 4d, a day to J. York and W. Cambridge. The craftsman, therefore, who had a family to keep was paid from 4d to 8d a day. His standard of living must have been considerably lower than that of the priest, who obtained the same allowance in money, but had no family to bring up. In a word, if we assume, what we have no right to assume, that a clergyman of the present day has the same standard of living as the priest of the 14th century, and when unmarried, lives in the same style, that is to say, without giving away money in charity, without buying books, without having a club, without traveling, living quite plainly, he could manage on about £80 a year compared with the priest's £6 or £7, so that money in the 14th century was worth about 12 times what it would purchase at the present day. But that theory breaks down when we consider that a sheep could be bought for a shilling and a cock or hen for 112d. Because at the present day, a sheep cannot be bought for 12 shillings and a cock or hen for 18p. So that it comes to what I said above, that it is perfectly impossible to ascertain the value of money in the 14th or any other century compared with this, unless we know a great quantity of things which we can never ascertain. Into the subject of dress we cannot venture, if only for the reason that the fashions changed then as now, and nearly as often. Some attempt was made at sumptuary laws, but without effect, for the simple reason that every woman will always, in every age, despite any laws to the contrary, dress herself as well as her means allows, and that with men's splendor of dress was then accepted as a proof of success and wealth. Their fashions were on the whole far more beautiful than those of modern days, and not more absurd. Chapter 10. Sport and Recreation. As regards the sports and pastimes of the city, there is cockfighting on Shrove Tuesday with hockey. Every Friday in Lent there are tournaments with disarmed lances. When Easter has made the river a little less inclement, there will be water sports, tilting in boats, etc. In the summer, the young men leap, dance, shoot, wrestle, cast the stone, practice their shields, play at quarterstaff, single stick, football, and bucklers. The maidens play their timbrels and dance as long as they can see. In spring, boars, bulls, badgers, and even horses are baited. When the water is frozen over, the young men slide and skate on bones, particularly on the marshy ground at Moorfields and behind Bankside. Many of the citizens keep hawks and hounds, for they have liberty of hunting in Middlesex, Hertfordshire, all Chiltern, and in Kent, to the water of Cray. Fitzstephen's description of London in the reign of Henry Roman II tells us this and much else. It is repeated by Stowe, who says that with the exception of the tilting on horseback, these sports were continued to his day. He then enumerates the sports and pastimes belonging to every successive season of the year. First, in the feast of Christmas, there was in the king's house, wheresoever he was lodged, a lord of misrule or master of merry disports, and the like had ye in the house of every nobleman of honor or good worship, were he spiritual or temporal, amongst the which the mayor of London, and either of the sheriffs, had their several lords of misrule, ever contending, without quarrel or offence, who should make the rarest pastimes to delight the beholders. These lords, beginning their rule on Allhallown Eve, continued the same till the morrow after the feast of the Purification, commonly called Candlemas Day. In all which space there was fine and subtle disguisings, masks, and mummeries, with playing at cards for counters, nails, and points in every house, more for pastime than for gain. Against the feast of Christmas, every man's house, as also the parish churches, were decked with home, ivy, bays, and whatsoever the season of the year afforded to be green. The conduits and standards in the streets were likewise garnished. Amongst the which I read, in the year 1444, that by tempest of thunder and lightning, on the 1st of February at night, Paul's steeple was fired, but with great labor quenched. And towards the morning of Candlemas Day at the Leadenhall in Cornhill, a standard of tree was being set up in the midst of the pavement, fast in the ground, nailed full of home and ivy, for disport of Christmas to the people, was torn up and cast down by the malignant spirit, as was thought, and the 308 stones of the pavement all about were cast in the streets, and into divers houses, so that the people were sore aghast of the great tempests. In the week before Easter had ye great shows made for the fetching in of a twisted tree, or with, as they termed it, out of the woods into the king's house, and the like into every man's house of honor or worship. In the month of May, namely, on May Day in the morning, every man, except impediment, would walk into the sweet meadows and green woods, there to rejoice their spirits with the beauty and savor of sweet flowers, and with the harmony of birds, praising God and their kind. And for example, hereof Edward Hall hath noted, that King Henry Roman VIII, as in the 3rd of his reign and divers other years, so namely in the 7th of his reign, on May Day in the morning, with Queen Catherine his wife, accompanied by many lords and ladies, rode a-maying from Greenwich to the high ground of Shooter's Hill, where, as they passed by the way, they espied a company of tall yeomen, clothed all in green, with green hoods and bows and arrows to the number of 200. One being their chieftain was called Robin Hood, who required the king and his company to stay and see his men shoot. Whereunto the king granting, Robin Hood whistled, and all the 200 archers shot off, loosing all at once. And when he whistled again, they likewise shot again. Their arrows whistled by craft of the head, so that the noise was strange and loud, which greatly delighted the king, queen, and their company. Moreover, this Robin Hood desired the king and queen, with their retinue, to enter the greenwood, where, in harbors made of boughs and decked with flowers, they were set and served plentifully with venison and wine by Robin Hood and his men, to their great contentment, and had other pageants and pastimes, as ye may read in my said author. I find also that in the month of May, the citizens of London of all estates, lightly in every parish, or sometimes 2 or 3 parishes joining together, had their several mayings, and did fetch in maypoles with divers warlike shows with good archers, morris dancers, and other devices, for pastime all the day long, and toward the evening they had stage plays and bonfires in the streets. Stowe's Survey. Stowe mentions the Lord of Misrule, but he hardly assigns sufficient importance to this functionary. The great event of the Christmas holidays were the masks, mummings, and frolics prepared and played by the Lord of Misrule, or the Master of the Revels, not only at court, but in every great house in the country. During his tenure of office, the Lord of Misrule was treated with all the deference and state that belonged to the king. He had his Lord Keeper, Treasurer, and bodyguard. His chaplains preached before him, bowing low as they entered the pulpit. His Master of Requests received petitions for him. He conferred knighthood, had his favorites, and was permitted to spend his money freely. At every one of the inns of court they had at Christmas a Lord of Misrule. The Lord of Misrule in the year 1551 was one George Ferrers, who gave great satisfaction not only to the king, but also to the city. For that year his style was Master of the King's Pastimes. Stowe says, Mr. Ferrers being Lord of the Merry Disports all the 12 days, so pleasantly and wisely behaved himself, that the king had great delight in his pastimes. On Monday the 4th of January he came by water to London, and landed at the Tower Wharf, entered the Tower, and then rode through Tower Street, where he was received by Serjeant Voss, Lord of Misrule, to John Maynard, one of the sheriffs of London, and so was conducted through the city, with a great company of young lords and gentlemen, to the house 309 of Sir Geo. Barn, Lord Mayor, where he with the chief of his company dined, and afterwards had a great banquet. And at his departure, the Lord Mayor gave him a standing cup with a cover of silver gilt, of the value of £10 for a reward. He also set a hogshead of wine and a barrel of beer at his gate for his train. That followed him. The rest of his gentlemen and servants dined at other aldermen's houses and with the sheriffs, and so departed to the Tower Wharf again, and to the court by water, to the great commendation of the mayor and aldermen, and highly accepted of the king and council. Archaeologia, Vol. Roman 18. Some of the bills and charges for the masks and plays presented by Ferrers remain to show the kind of entertainment provided. There were, for instance, 4 challengers and 20 horses properly apparelled. The Lord of Misrule was attended by his heir, his other sons, his base sons, councillors, pages of honour, gentlemen ushers, sergeants at arms, a provost marshal, heralds, trumpeters, and an orator, a jailer, a footman, jugglers, Irishmen, and fools. The masque was the triumph of Mars and Venus. There were jousts and tournaments. There were mock courts of justice, with a pillory, stocks, and sham executions. The whole show was magnificently mounted, as appears from the following bill for dressing the Lord of Misrule himself. For Christmas Day in that week, the Lord of Misrule himself had a robe of white baudekyn, containing 9 yards at 16s. A yard, guarded with a great embroidered guard of cloth of gold, wrought in knots, 14 yards at 13s. 4d. A yard having a fur of red feathers with a cape of chamblet thrum. A coat of flat silver fine with works, 5 yards at 50 shillings, with an embroidered guard of leaves of gold and silk colored, containing 15 yards at 20 shillings. A cap of maintenance of red feathers and chamblet thrum, very rich, with a plume of feathers. A pair of hosen, the breeches made of a guard of cloth of gold embroidered in panes, 9 yards of gardened at 13s. 4d. Lined with silver sarcenet, 1l at 8 shillings. A pair of buskins of white baudekyn, 1 yard at 16 shillings. A pair of pannicles of bridges, Bruges satin 3s, 4d. A girdle of yellow sarcenet, 16d. The cost £51, 17.4. Archaeologia, Vol. Roman 18. But there are other details not yet mentioned. The year's sports very properly began with the New Year's gifts. These gifts the husband gives his wife and father eke the child. And master on his men bestows the like with favour mild. And good beginning of the year they wish and wish again, according to the ancient guise of heathen people vain. Then 8 days no man doth require his debts of any man. Their tables do they furnish forth with all the meat they can. On the day before Ascension, there was the annual beating of the bounds, a custom still observed, but without the old ceremony of beating each other for the better preservation of the memory of the ancient boundaries. At Whitsuntide there was feasting with Whitsun ale. Stowe has told us how May Day was kept, but he writes as an old man, coldly. The full meaning of May Day he has forgotten. Remember what it meant for the young Londoner. It fell on what is now the 12th of May, a time when, except at very rare springs, the biting east wind is over and spring has really begun. The leaves and blossoms are out at last 3:10 after struggling against the cold winds since the middle of March. The days have lengthened. It is now light till 9 o'clock and twilight all the night through. There is no more huddling around the fire, perhaps without candles, going off to bed as soon as is possible, rising before the break of day, sitting all day long in a workshop darkened by the lowering of the shutters as well as by the dreary gray skies of winter, working with frozen fingers, living on salt meat for 6 months except for the fast days and the 40 days of Lent, when for a change there was salted fish. Spring had come at last, and in this northern clime the city, like the gardens and the fields, sprang into new life and returned to the joy of living. Then all went out into the fields on May Day Eve. They passed over the marshy and muddy plain of Moorfields till they came to the little village of Eiselden or Eiselden, where the great forest began. There grew the whitethorn and the blackthorn, the broom and the gorse blossomed. There the wild crab was covered with a garment of pink and white, and the wild rose was all glorious to behold. The people came home bearing boughs of those sweet blossoms, singing and dancing as they went. With them marched the lusty fellow with pipe and tabor. With them ran barking and fighting, for pure joy, all the dogs of the parish. Then they set up their maypole adorned with ribbons and garlands, and they danced around it, singing, hand in hand, right hand with left hand, and left hand with right, covered with chaplets of wild rose and wild apple blossom. As at Christmas they celebrated the close of the old year and the beginning of the new, so now they celebrated the end of the winter and the birth of the spring. They had tomfools, mummers, hobby horses, Robin Hood, Maid Marian, Little John. They had bonfires, and they had feasting and drinking. 'Twas the most joyous festival of all the year. On the feast of St. Bartholomew were held athletic sports with races, archery, and wrestling. At Holyrood they went nutting in the woods. At Martinmas they feasted, I know not why. Then in the long summer days they celebrated the eves of festivals, and the festivals themselves by a kind of open house hospitality. Then burned bonfires in the streets. This was partly with a view to keep off infection, and certainly in their narrow streets it was necessary to renew the air as much as possible. Then the wealthier sort spread tables before their doors, and furnished them on the vigils with bread and drink, and on the festival days with meat and drink, to which they would invite all passers-by, praising God for his benefits bestowed upon them. There were feasts of reconciliation and amity for those who had quarreled. The Feast of Reconciliation was a ceremony observed down to the last century. A kind of flower feast was held on the vigil of St. John the Baptist, and on the days of St. Peter and St. Paul the Apostles. Then every man's door was 311 decorated with green birch, long fennel, St. John's wort, orpin, white latten, and such like. Garlands of flowers were hung up among the leaves, with small lamps of glass containing enough oil to last all through the night. There were branches of wrought iron hung out over the street thus decorated, and some houses had hundreds of lamps hung up all over them. Picture to yourself a street in old London, narrow, with lofty gabled houses projecting in each story, so that at the top one might almost shake hands across. Even in the soft and limpid twilight of a June evening, it is generally almost dark in the streets thus deprived of the sky, but tonight it is lighter than at noontide. There are rows on rows, one row above the others of bright lamps, red and blue and green, gleaming among green branches and white flowers. There are people dancing and pledging each other. There is music, nay, not pipe and tabor only, but harp and rebeck, flute and silver bells, drum and syrinx. And of course the lads and maidens are dancing with all the spirit they possess. A hunting party. From 14th century MS, Bibliothèque Nat de Paris. Dancing was a passion with everybody. From the queen to the milkmaid, all the women danced. From the king to the craftsman, all the young men danced. They danced in the streets whenever it was possible, which was one of the reasons why May Day was so joyous a festival. The more courtly people had dances dignified and stately, such as the dance au verlet, in which each performer sang a verse, and then they all danced round singing the same verse in chorus. The pas de Brabant, where every man knelt to his partner. The dance au chaplet, where every man kissed his partner. They danced together singing minstrels 312 songs. They danced in the garden, they danced in the meadow, they went out at night to dance with tapers in their hands. They danced to beautiful music played by an orchestra. But for the humbler folk the street was the ballroom, and the pipe and tabor the music, while the dance was the simple hay, or a round with capers of surprising agility, or the interlacing of hands and the dancing round a maypole. The wrestling match filled much the same place in the civic mind as the football match of the present day. It was not a sport so much as a battle, and occasionally, as in the case of London v. Westminster, it caused serious riots and disturbances. The usual prize at a wrestling match was a ram, or a ram and a ring. Sometimes there were more valuable prizes, as in the old poem, A Merry Jest of Robin Hood, quoted by Strutt, 10 in which a white bull, a courser with saddle and bridle, a pair of gloves, a gold ring, and a pipe of wine were prizes. In Chaucer's prologue we read, At wrastling he wold have alwy the ram. And Matthew Paris mentions a wrestling match at Westminster, AD 1222, at which a ram was the prize. Then there was the valuable right of hunting in the forest of Middlesex. The country was nearly covered with a vast forest, opened up here and there by the clearings of charcoal burners, woodcutters, and licensed huntsmen. The forest of Middlesex extended on the east side far into Essex. It was filled with fallow deer, red deer, wild swine, and wild boar. Of vermin there were wolves still, wild cats, foxes, badgers, and the smaller creatures. The rabbit warren or the coney garth was found on every estate, partly for food and partly for the fur. 2,000 rabbits were supplied in 1 year for the table of a rich Norfolk squire. Hares and pheasants were bred in the coney garth. The crane, the bittern, the great bustard, together with wild ducks and smaller birds innumerable, were also found by the marshes along the riverside or in the forests. It is noted that in London even the craftsmen feasted freely on hares and rabbits. Music was even a more favorite form of recreation than dancing. To learn the use of some instrument was part of every gentleman's education. The details of the education of the lower class are scanty, but there is a treasury of manners and customs in Chaucer, from which it is certain that all classes learned and practiced music of some kind. For instance, of the squire, he is said to have been singing or fluting all the day. Of the nun the poet says, "Full well she sang the service divine, and tuned in higher nose full seemly." The pardoner the friar, the nun's priest the second nun. Types of Chaucer's characters. From the Ellesmere MS. Of the mendicant friar. And certainly he had a merry note. Well couth he singe and play on a rote. Somewhat he lipsed for his wantonness, to make his English sweet upon his tongue. And in his harping when that he had sung, his eyecon twinkled in his hedia right, as do the starus in the frosty night. Of the miller, a bagpipe well could he blow and sown. Of the pardoner, full loud he sang, "Come hider love to me." Of the scholar, and all above there lay a gay sautre psaltery, on which he made a night's melody, so sweetly that all the chamber rang. And Angelus et Virginum he sang. Of the carpenter's wife, but of her song it was so loud and yearn brisk, as an eye swall we chitering on a burn. And so on, they could all sing and play. It was a disgrace for any not to play some kind of instrument. A bas-relief on a capital in a Norman church of the 11th century represents a concert in which the performers are playing on different instruments. There was the violin, the violoncello, the guitar, the harp, the syrinx or Pandora pipes, a zither, great bells and little bells, and an unintelligible instrument. The list does not include the flute, pipe, or whistle of various kinds. The bagpipe, the lute, the trumpet, the horn, the water organ, the wind organ, the cymbals, the drum, the psaltery, the three-stringed organistrum, the hurdy-gurdy, the pipe and tabor, the rebec, and others. Of course, many of them are but varieties. The instruments dear to the common people were the fiddle and the pipe and tabor, at the music of which the bear capered, the bull was baited, the prentices and maidens danced, and the tumblers performed. At the tap of the tabor, and the call of the pipe, everybody turned out to see what was going on. In every tavern there was music of a more pretentious kind. There sat the harper, there the mandolin was touched by those who sat in the place to drink. Then to flute and viol the dancing girl gave her performance. Then the storyteller sang his long tale to the sound of the lute in a low monotone, while the music rambled up and down, in the same way as a Welsh singer sings, while the air itself rolls round and round about his words. In every church there was the organ, sometimes only a hand organ, sometimes a great and glorious organ, the thunders of which awed the trembling soul while its soft notes uplifted and cheered the worshipper. There was long opposition to the introduction of the organ, and it was not until the 13th century that the voice of opposition was hushed 315 altogether. Once the organ found admission, the difficulty was to make it splendid enough. Winchester boasted as early as the year 951 an organ divided into parts, each with its own bellows, its own keyboard, and its own organist. At Milan Cathedral, the organ pipes were made of silver. At Venice, they were made of gold. The best organs of Western Europe were made after the model of an organ presented by Constantine Copronymus to King Pepin. A banquet. From Williman, monuments, inedits, etc. Another form of recreation in the city life was the garden. The poetry of the 14th and 15th centuries is full of the garden. In Chaucer's Knight's Tale, Emily goes into the garden to make a chaplet. And in the garden at the sauna priest, She walketh up and down, and as here list, she gatereth flowers, party white and red, to make a sodal girland for her head. And as an angel heavenly she song. Every house of importance in London had its garden. Of these gardens, some traces yet remain. The Draper's Garden, until recently covered a large area, and 316 there is still a little left. Other companies retain some portion of their old gardens. Apart from the churchyards, now converted into gardens, there are still, even in some crowded parts of the city, one or two private gardens left. The garden afforded a safe and pleasant place of recreation for the ladies of the house. It seems as if, with the noise, the dirt, the crowds, the violence, there was no place for ladies in the streets of medieval London. They were escorted to and from church, and for the rest of the day there was the house or the garden, full of leaves and of flowers. And craft of man's hand so curiously arrayed had the garden of such priss, as if it were the very paradise. Here the ladies kept their singing birds, of which they were extremely fond. King and Jester. From Ms. in British Museum, Harl, 1892. Then for recreation in the daily life, we have the morning mass, the several services of the church, the work of the shop for the craftsman, the house for his wife. In summer evenings ramblings in the fields, rowing on the river, dancing in the streets, athletics of all kinds for the young. For the men the tavern with its songs and drink. For the women, talk in the street at the house doors in the summer. In the evening, work and music and singing and talk before the fire. In addition to the festivals and the rejoicings on stated days, there was the procession of the watch, the miracle play within the church or without, the royal pageants, and the city ridings. The procession of the watches has been given in London in the time of the Tudors, p. 362. The squire the miller. The sergeant-at-law the reeve. Types of Chaucer's characters. From the Ellesmere, MS. What part, if any, had cards in the houses of medieval London? The origin of card-playing need not concern us here. Probably the theory that cards first appeared at Viterbo, whether they were brought from the East, is true. That they spread over Italy, Germany, France, and Spain is quite certain. In the year 1393 occurs the well-known and often quoted passage in the account of the treasurer of France, Charles Poupart, given to Grinfenor, painter, for 3 packs of cards, gilt and colored, and variously ornamented, for the amusement of the king, 56 livres. From this passage, it has been argued that cards were invented for the solace of the mad King Charles Roman VI. But if they were a new invention, the entry would not have been made with such simplicity. And, in fact, we now know that cards had before this date been brought into France. Whatever was known or practiced in France speedily crossed over to England. Yet it is remarkable that Chaucer makes no mention of card playing. In the year 1463 it was practiced. This is proved by a clause in an act of 1463, by which the importation of cards, among other wares of foreign manufacture, was forbidden. In one of the Paston letters, dated Dec. 24, 1484, Marjorie Paston tells her husband that in a certain great lady's house there were at Christmas no disguisings, nor harpings, nor luting, nor singing, nor none loud disputes, but playing at the tables, chess, and cards. It may therefore be assumed that card-playing was known in London during the 15th century, that it was not an amusement or a form of gambling belonging to the common sort, but that it belonged to the wealthier class. This is what we should expect from the cost of the early cards with their gold and their hand-painted faces and backs. Of gambling with dice, a great deal is said, and it would appear the lower classes as well as the upper classes were greatly addicted to dice and games of pure chance. Every tavern had its gaming table. The keeper advanced money to those who lost. There were then as now gamesters of charns who gambled away all that they had and more. In the satirical drawings of the time they are represented as having stripped themselves of everything, including every shred of clothing. The lower classes of London have always been, and are still, incurably addicted to the pursuit of fortune, blind and incapable of favoritism. Laying on the odds and backing his fancy takes the place with the young Londoner of the old-fashioned dice. For games we have the rhyme, the men and maids do merry make at stool ball and at barley break. The games played by boys were hoop and hide and seek, Harry racket, Philip the toad, who's and blind, hoodwink play, loggets, slide sheriff or shove groat. To wrestle, play at stoolabal or to run. To pitch the bar or to shoot off a gun. To play at luggets, 9 holes or 10 pins. To try it out at football by the shins. Fitzstephen says that on Shrove Tuesday the boys brought cocks to school and made them fight. The master received from every boy a cockpenny. The custom was kept up in some parts of England, I believe in the town of Lancaster, until well into the 18th century. With all these aids to rest and recreation, it will be seen that London was a city full of joy and cheerfulness. But there was a great deal more than this. No city on the continent, not even Antwerp, Bruges, or Paris, surpassed London in the splendor and magnificence of her pageants and ridings. They were the public processions and rejoicings at coronations, whether of the king or his consort, those after great victories, those when the king rode in state through London, those in which foreign sovereigns were received, and the writings of the mayor and aldermen. Let us consider what was meant by such a pageant in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the period to which this chapter belongs. They were rare events, naturally. A coronation does not happen often in one generation. So rare were they that the principal pageants can all be enumerated in a few lines. Thus, AD 1205 Reception of Otho, nephew to King John. 1216 Louis the Dauphin. 1236 Henry Roman III. 1243 Beatrice, Countess of Provence. 1274 Queen Margaret. 1307 Queen Isabella. 1328 Queen Philippa. 1357 King John of France. 1363 King John of France, King David of Scotland, and the King of Cyprus. 1377 King Richard Roman II. 1382 Queen Anne. 1392 Reconciliation of King Richard Roman II and the city. 1396 Coronation of Queen Isabella. 1399 Henry Roman IV. 1399 Reception of Emmanuel, Emperor of Constantinople. 1413 Coronation of Henry V. 1415 Return of Henry V after Agincourt. 1416 Reception of the Emperor Sigismund. 1421 Return of Henry V and Queen Catherine. 1422 Reception of infant King Henry Roman VI. 1432 Henry Roman VI. 1445 Margaret of Anjou. 1461 Coronation of Edward Roman IV. 1465 Queen Elizabeth Grey. 1483 Reception of Edward V. 1483 Coronation of Richard Roman III. Thus in 278 years there were 27 pageants and receptions, an average of one in every 10 years. It is certain that at every coronation there was some kind of pageant or procession, but there seems no record of those of Kings Edward Roman II and Roman III. The first of which a detailed account has come down to us is the reception of Henry Roman III, on his marriage in 1286. It is by Matthew Paris, 320. There were assembled at the king's nuptial festivities such a host of nobles of both sexes, such numbers of religious men, such crowds of the populace, and such a variety of actors, that London with its capacious bosom could scarcely contain them. The whole city was ornamented with flags and banners, chaplets and hangings, candles and lamps, and with wonderful devices and extraordinary representations, and all the roads were cleansed from mud and dirt, sticks and everything offensive. The citizens, too, went out to meet the king and queen dressed in their ornaments, and vied with each other trying the speed of their horses. On the same day when they left the city for Westminster, to perform the duties of butler to the king, which office belonged to them by right of old, at the coronation, they proceeded thither dressed in silk garments, with mantles worked in gold, and with costly changes of raiment, mounted on valuable horses, glittering with new bits and saddles, and riding in troops arranged in order. They carried with them 360 gold and silver cups, preceded by the king's trumpeters, and with horns sounding, so that such a wonderful novelty struck all who beheld it with astonishment. The Archbishop of Canterbury, by the right especially belonging to him, performed the duty of crowning with the usual solemnities, the Bishop of London assisting him as a dean, the other bishops taking their stations according to their rank. In the same way all the abbots, at the head of whom, as was his right, was the abbot of St. Albans, for as the proto-martyr of England, B. Alban was the chief of all the martyrs of England, so also was his abbot the chief of all the abbots in rank and dignity, as the authentic privilege of that church set forth. The nobles, too, performed the duties, which, by ancient right and custom, pertained to them at the coronations of kings. In like manner, some of the inhabitants of certain cities discharged certain duties which belonged to them by right of their ancestors. The Earl of Chester carried the sword of St. Edward, which was called curtain, before the king, as a sign that he was Earl of the Palace, and had by right the power of restraining the king if he should commit an error. The Earl was attended by the Constable of Chester, and kept the people away with a wand when they pressed forward in a disorderly way. The Grand Marshal of England, the Earl of Pembroke, carried a wand before the king, and cleared the way before him both in the church and in the banquet hall, and arranged the banquet and the guests at table. The wardens of the Cinque Ports carried the pall over the king, supported by 4 spears, but the claim to this duty was not altogether undisputed. The Earl of Leicester supplied the king with water in basins to wash before his meal. The Earl Warren performed the duty of king's cupbearer, supplying the place of the Earl of Arundel, because the latter was a youth and not as yet made a belted knight. Master Michael Billet was butler ex officio. The Earl of Hereford performed the duties of marshal of the king's household, and William Beauchamp held the station as almoner. The justiciary of 321, the Forests arranged the drinking cups on the table at the king's right hand, although he met with some opposition, which however fell to the ground. The citizens of London passed the wine about in all directions, in costly cups, and those of Winchester superintended the cooking of the feast. The rest, according to the ancient statutes, filled their separate stations, or made their claim to do so. And in order that the nuptial festivities might not be clouded by any disputes, saving the right of anyone, many things were put up with for the time which they left for decision at a more favorable opportunity. The office of Chancellor of England and all the offices connected with the king are ordained and assized in the Exchequer. Therefore the Chancellor, the Chamberlain, the Marshal, and the Constable, by right of their office, took their seats there, as also did the barons according to the date of their creation, in the city of London, whereby they each knew his own place. The ceremony was splendid, with the gay dresses of the clergy and knights who were present. The Abbot of Westminster sprinkled the holy water, and the treasurer, acting the part of subdean, carried the paten. Why should I describe all those persons who reverently ministered in the church to God as was their duty? Why describe the abundance of meats and dishes on the table, the quantity of venison, the variety of fish, the joyous sounds of the gleemen, and the gaiety of the waiters? Whatever the world could afford to create pleasure and magnificence was there brought together from every quarter. Giles's Trans, pp. 8-9. Tournament of the Earl of Warwick. From Strutt's Manners and Customs. It must have been a wealthy city which could thus furnish for a coronation banquet 360 wealthy citizens, who could afford to dress in silk with gold-embroidered mantles, and to ride stately horses richly caparisoned, and to carry every man a gold or silver cup, and to decorate and light up their houses with flags and banners, chaplets and hangings, candles and lamps. The magnificent dress of the citizen at all these pageants strikes one with astonishment. They welcomed Queen Margaret in 1300 to the number of 600, in a livery of red and white, each with the cognizance of his mystery embroidered on his sleeve. They followed King Henry Roman IV. In 1399 with a train of 6,000 horse, all of London and clothed in their proper livery. When Henry V came home after Agincourt, the mayor and aldermen met him clothed in orient grain scarlet, with 400 citizens in Murray, well mounted, with collars and chains of gold. With them went a multitude of the city clergy in sumptuous copes with rich crosses and massy censers. Coronation of Henry Roman IV. From Froissart's Chronicles. The Lord Mayor's show began with the presentation of the mayor, elect to the king, or his justiciary. The new mayor had to ride to Westminster. Of course he rode in state with the sheriffs, aldermen, and officers of the city. It was in 1452 that John Norman, then mayor, is said to have changed the custom of riding by land to going by barge. For this purpose he presented the city with a beautiful barge. The companies followed his example, and provided themselves with barges. Of course it was no new thing for a wealthy citizen or a nobleman to have his barge. The Thames was always, until quite recent times, the chief highway of the city. Witness the line of palaces which lay along its north bank from Baynard's Castle to the King's House of Westminster. The innovation of Norman was to present the city with its barge of state. There is reason to believe that before his time some of the journeys to Westminster had been made by water. Some notes of the cost of 323 such a procession have been preserved. For instance, in the year 1401, on the riding of John Walcote, mayor, there is the following entry in the books of the Grocers' Company. Pound SD. Idem, Mirza Verspeya Polashevesh du John Walcote mayor, po Roman 6 minstrels po. Lo saber excel. Idem po lo chepris and po, lo pesher viad. It po, lo diner and po vin po la chaucer Roman 21. Idem, po on cluviu po la bij eage. English Knights Travelling. From Ms. in British Museum, Harl, 1319. The wealth and state of the city itself were confided to the care of the mayor and aldermen, who lost no opportunity, whether by a riding, or a pageant, or a feast, of exhibiting the wealth of the city by the liveries and splendor of dress worn by the citizens. Thus, Stowe gives some particulars on the subject, which help to show us the real wealth of the citizens. 1236, the 20th of Henry Roman III. The mayor, aldermen, sheriffs, and citizens of London rode out to meet the king and his new wife Queen Eleanor, daughter to Raymond Berengarius of Aragon, Earl of Provence and Narbonne. The citizens were clothed in long garments, embroidered about with gold, and silk in divers colors, their horses finely trapped, to the number of 360, every man bearing a gold or silver cup in his hand, the king's trumpets before them sounding, etc., as ye may read in my annals. The 29th of Edward I, the said king took to wife Margaret, sister to Philip le Beau, king of France. They were married at Canterbury. The queen was conveyed to London, against whom the citizens to the number of 600 rode in one livery of white and red, with the cognizances of their mysteries embroidered upon their sleeves. They received her 4 miles out of London, and so conveyed her to Westminster. The 3rd of Henry V, the said king arriving at Dover, the mayor of London, with the aldermen and craftsmen riding in red, with hoods red and white, met with the king on the Black Hithe, coming from Eltham with his prisoners out of France. The 10th of Henry Roman VI, he being crowned in France, returning into England, came to Eltham towards London, and the mayor of London, John Wells, the alderman with the commonalty, rode against him on horseback, the mayor in crimson velvet, a great velvet hat furred, a girdle of gold about his middle, and a bawdrake of gold about his neck. Trilling down behind him, his 3 henchseem, on 3 great coursers following him, in one suit of red, all spangled in silver. Then the aldermen in gowns of scarlet, with sanguine hoods, and all the commonalty of the city clothed in white gowns and scarlet hoods, with divers cognizances embroidered on their sleeves, etc. The 1st of Henry Roman VII. The mayor, aldermen, sheriffs, and commonalty, all clothed in violet as in a mourning color, met the king at Shireditch and conveyed him to Bowles Church, where he offered his banners. Thus much for liveries of citizens in ancient times, both in triumphs and otherwise, may suffice, whereby may be observed that the coverture of men's heads was then hoods. For neither cap nor hat is spoken of, except that John Wells, mayor of London, to wear a hat in time of triumph, but differing from the hats lately taken in use, and now commonly worn for noblemen's liveries. I read that Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, in the reign of Edward Roman II, gave at Christmas in liveries to such as served him, 159 broadcloths, allowing to every garment furs to fur their hoods. More near our time, thereby remaineth the counterfeits and pictures of aldermen and others that lived in the reigns of Henry Roman VI and Edward Roman IV, namely, Alderman Darby, dwelling in Fenchurch Street, over against the parish church of St. Dionis, left his picture, as of an alderman in a gown of scarlet on his back, a hood on his head, etc., as is in that house and elsewhere to be seen. For a further monument of those late times, men may behold the glass windows of the mayor's court in the Guildhall above the stairs. The mayor is there pictured sitting in habit, party-colored, and a hood on his head, his sword-bearer before him with a hat or cap of maintenance. The common clerk and other officers bareheaded, their hoods on their shoulders, and therefore I take it that the use of square bonnets worn by noblemen, gentlemen, citizens, and others took beginning in the realm by Henry Roman VII, and in his time and of further antiquity I can see no counterfeit or other proof of use. Henry Roman VIII, towards his latter reign, wore a flat round cap of scarlet or of velvet, with a brooch or jewel and a feather. Divers gentlemen, courtiers, and others did the like. The youthful citizens also took them to the new fashion of flat caps knitted of woolen yarn black, but so light that they were obliged to tie them under their chins, for else the wind would be master over them. The use of these flat round caps so far increased, being of less price than the French bonnet, that in short time the young aldermen took the wearing of them. Sir John White wore it in his mayoralty, and was the first that left example to his followers. But now the Spanish felt, or the like counterfeit, is most commonly, of all men both spiritual and temporal, taken to use, so that the French bonnet or square cap, and also the round cap, have for the most part given place to the Spanish felt. But yet in London amongst the graver sort, I mean the liveries of companies, remaineth a memory of the hoods of old time worn by their predecessors. These hoods were worn, the roundlets upon their heads, the skirts to hang behind in their necks to keep them warm, the tippet to lie on their shoulder, or to wind about their necks. These hoods were of old time made in colors according to their gowns, which were of 2 colors as red and blue, or red and purple, murrey, or as it pleased their masters and wardens to appoint to the companies. But now of late time they have used their gowns to be all of one color, and those of the saddest, but their hoods being made the one half of the same cloth their gowns be of, the other half remaineth red as of old time. The age was, above all, martial, therefore battle reel or battle mimic was the sport which mostly moved the people. The tournament was nominally a mimic battle, yet it so closely resembled a real battle, and so often ended in wounds or death that it was sometimes difficult to distinguish between a tournament and a duel. At the Tilt Yard at Whitehall, in Tothill Fields, at Smithfield, and in Cheapside, tournaments were held. Among the most famous tournaments were the following: 325. That of 1329 in Cheapside, when the scaffolding erected for the Queen and her ladies fell, fortunately without injury to the Queen. A tournament in London. From Froissart's Chronicles. Those of 1357, 1362, and 1374. The last was especially splendid. It was held in honor of Alice Perrers, the Lady of the Sun, and continued for 7 days. The magnificent tournament held by Richard Roman II. In 1390, which was also continued for several days, and was attended by 60 combatants. The famous encounter of Scottish with English knights in 1393, that of French and English knights at Smithfield in 1409, the challenge of a knight of Aragon who was defeated by Robert Carey. The challenge, 1442, of another knight of Aragon, Sir Philip le Beauf, who was defeated by John Ansley. The challenge, 1467, of the bastard of Burgundy. These challenges were more than joustings, they were duels to the death. The Burgundian knight challenged Lord Scales, brother of the Queen. They fought for 3 days. On the first they fought on foot without result. On the second they fought on horseback, when the Burgundian's horse fell with him. On the third they fought with poleaxes until the point of Lord Scales' axe entered his antagonist's helmet, so that he could have thrown him to the ground and killed him. But the king threw down his warder and discontinued the combat. In 1501 there was a tournament in the Tower. In 1540 there was a 5 days tournament at Westminster. In 1571, 1581, and 1599 there were tournaments, but not on the same scale as formerly. In 1610 the last tournament was held in the Tilt Yard, Westminster, in honor of Henry, Prince of Wales. Chapter 11. Literature and Science in London. The libraries of London. The libraries in London were few in number, and, according to modern ideas, scanty as to the works they contained. Every monastery had its library. St. Paul's Cathedral had its library. There were books of devotion belonging to every church, and, indeed, to every house, but of private libraries there were very few. The famous Duke Humphrey had a great collection of books, which he gave to the University of Oxford in 2 donations, one of 264 volumes, the other of 265. The Duke of Bedford at the same time bought the collection of Charles V of France and brought the books over to England. Guy Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, had another great library. The finest libraries in London were those of the Franciscans, whose library was built for them by Whittington, and the Dominicans, who in their best days were remarkable for their pursuit of learning. John Lydgate presenting his Life of St. Edmund to Henry Roman VI. From Ms. in British Museum, Harl, 2278. The catalogue of the books presented by Guy Beauchamp to the monks of Bordesley shows what was the lighter reading of the brethren. It is as follows. A tus Isaacs qui cest letter veront, o oront, Guy de Beauchamp, Comte de War. Salas and Dieu. Salas nous aver bail en la garde l'abbe le covent de Bordesley, laisse demora tous jours tous les romances de sans noms. CEO est a saver, un volume, qui est appel tresser. Un volume, en lequel est le premier livre de Lancelot, et un volume del romance de Ignes. Un sauter de romance. Un volume des Evangelis, et de vie des Seine. Un volume qui pili des quatre principales gestes de Charles, et de Douan, et de Mace, et de Gerard de Vienne, et de Emery de Narbonne. Un volume del romance Emond de Ageland, et du roi Charles Douan de Nantil. Et le romance de Guyon de Nantil. Et un volume del romance Titus et Vespasien. Et un volume del romance Joseph of Arimathie et du Saint Grail. Et un volume qui pili comment Adam Fust and ist hors de paradis, et la Genesi. Et un volume en lequel sont contenas towns des romances, cos de saver, vidas patrimi commencement, et pus un conte de Audipt, et la vision Saint Paul, et pus les vies des Roman 12 saints, et la romance de William de Langesp, et autorites des saints hums, et la mirror de Almy. Un volume ni lequel sont contenas la vie Saint Pierre et Saint Paul, et des auteurs live. Et un volume qui est appel el Apocalypse. Et un livre de physique et de surgery. Un volume del romance de Guy, et de la reine tut enterment. Un volume del romance de Troyes. Un volum del romans de Willem de Oranges e de Teben de Arabi. Un volum del romans de Amis e de Iden. Un volum del romans Gerard de Vien. Un volum del romans du Brut e del Roy Constantine. Un volum de l'enseignement Aristotle en Veas au Roy Alexander. Un volum en lequel sont contenas les ufonces noster signor, comment il fust mine en Egypt. E la vi Saint Edud. E la vision Saint Paul. La vengeance ener signor parvespasian a Titus. E la vi Saint Nicholas, qui fust nesen patris. E la vi Saint Eustace. E la vi Saint Cudlec. E la passion ener signor. E la meditation Saint Bernard de ener Dame Saint Marie. E del passion sour Deus fis Jesu Christ ener Saint. E la vi Saint Euphrasie. E la vi Saint Radegonde. E la vi Saint Julian. Un volum, en lequel est apres d'enfants et lumière les. Un volum del romans de Alexander, of Paintures. Un petit rouge liver, en lequel sont contenas mons diverses choses. Un volum del romans des Merchants, e de Feribres 329 e de Alexander. Lescus livers nous grantis par nos atures e per nos assigns, qu'il de morant, en la dit abbi, etc. The more serious part of these libraries may be gathered from the Glastonbury list, which contains the following classical authors: Aristotle, Livy, Orosius, Sallust, Donatus, Sedulus, Virgil Need, Virgil's Georgics, Virgil's Bucolics, Aesop, Tully, Boethius, Plated, Isagoge of Porphyry, Prudentius, Forduanus, Persius, Gisidor, Smaragdus, Martianus, Horace, Priscian, Prosper, Claudian, Juvenal, Cornudus. While the list of 40 books collected by Abbot John de Taunton and given to the library in 1271 is instructive. St. Augustine upon Genesis, Ecclesiastical Dogmas, St. Bernard's Enchiridion, St. Bernard's Flowers, Books of Wisdom with a gloss, Postils upon Jeremiah and the Lesser Prophets, Concordances to the Bible, Postils of Albertus upon Matthew, and the Lamentations of Jeremiah and others in one volume, Postils upon Mark, Postils upon John, with a discourse on the epistles throughout the year, Brother Thomas, Old and New Gloss, Moralities on the Gospels and Epistles, St. Augustine on the Trinity, Epistles of Paul Glost, St. Augustine's City of God, Kilwardesby upon the letter of the sentences, Questions concerning crimes, Perfection of the spiritual life, Brother Thomas, Sum of Divinity in 4 volumes, Decrees and Decretals, A Book of Perspectives, Distinctions of Morris, Books of Natural History in 2 volumes, Books on the Properties of Things. The disposition and arrangement of a medieval library has been treated by Mr. Willis Clark in his Reed Lecture for 1894. The books were at first kept in the cloister, but since our climate would very speedily destroy books lying in the open air, there were aumbrys or presses constructed for them. In course of time the cloister was flagged, and the readers were provided with carrels, i.e., small wooden pews or cupboards, closed except in the front, which was open to 3:30 the light. Each carrel contained a desk on which to lay the books. The next step was the construction of the library. That built by Whittington for the Franciscans was a noble hall, 129 feet long and 31 feet broad. It contained 28 desks and 28 double settles of wainscot. Certain books remained always on the desks for reference, and others were brought out from time to time, and both sorts were chained. In some cases, an upright bookcase had an open shelf in front on which books could be read, but they were all chained in their places. This caused the books to be ranged with their backs towards the wall. In some cases, when books were embossed on the side, they were not placed side by side, but flat on the shelf. The chaining of books in all monastic libraries was the constant rule. Since every monastery had its scriptorium, it is reasonable to believe that copies of books were continually being renewed, when the scribes were not occupied in renewing the books wanted for service in the chapel. In every monastery, also, there were illuminators and painters. Lastly, to show that the much-abused friars made good use of the libraries they possessed, there is a list of scholars given in Stephen's Monasticon, 11, from which it appears that 80 names of learned scholars and writers may be found among the Dominicans, as many as 122 among the Franciscans, and 137 among the Carmelites. A good deal of information remains concerning the Library of St. Paul's. It contained, among other treasures, 11 MSS of the Gospels beautifully written and bound with silver covers richly enameled. There were also 5 psalters, 8 antiphonals, 20 books of homilies, 17 missals, manuals, graduals, treposia, organ books, epistle books, gospel books, collectaria and capitularia, pontificals, benedictionals. There were Bibles and portions of scripture with glosses, and there was the Chronicle of Ralph de Deisto. There was another library in the precinct of St. Paul's, and that was founded by Walter Sherrington. In it were books on medicine, chronicles, grammars, the fathers, classical authors, and books on law. Roman II, London and literature. The connection of medieval London with literature and learning must be considered first in the light of ecclesiastical history, and next from the secular point of view. How far were monastic institutions in general, and those of London in particular, homes of learning and literature? The question can be answered by inference from what we know of other monasteries, not in London, and by the examples of scholars and writers who sprang from those houses. In the first place, by far the greater number of scholars and writers, for 800 years 331 worked in the religious houses. If we run through a list, however imperfect, we shall see that, especially in the writing of histories, monks and later friars are conspicuous. Such a list is instructive and suggestive. Page from Pleshy Bible. For instance, Bede was a monk of Durham. Egbert, Archbishop of York, was a monk of Hexham. Alcuin of York. John Scotus or Erigena was a monk. Eadmer, who wrote the Life of Anselm, was a monk of Canterbury. The Saxon Chronicle was carried on by monks. Astern, another monk of Canterbury, wrote the lives of St. Dunstan and St. Alphege. Lucian, monk of Eberberg, wrote an account of Chester. Colman, monk of Worcester, wrote the life of Bishop Wulstan of that see. Turgot, monk of Jarrow, wrote the history of the monastery 332 of Durham. The famous Ordericus Vitalis was a monk of St. Everalt, Normandy. The great historian, William of Malmesbury, belonged to the monastery of that town. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a monk in the monastery of the town he is called after. Henry of Huntingdon, another well-known historian, was a monk at Romsey. Aelred of Revolx was a Cistercian. Hilarius, who wrote the Miracle Plays, was an English monk. Walter of Evesham was a monk of that place. Layman was a priest. Roger Bacon was a Grey friar, as was also Duns Scotus. Roger of Wendover was a monk of St. Albans. Of the same monastery was Matthew Paris. Bartholomew Cotton was a monk of Norwich. Matthew of Westminster was a Benedictine, probably of St. Peter S. Ralph or Ranulph. Higden was a monk of St. Werburg S. Robert of Brunnan was a canon of the Gilbertine order. Nigel Wyerker, author of Brunellis, was precentor in the Benedictine monastery of Canterbury. John of Salisbury, author of De Nugis Curialum, was a monk in La Selle, in the French diocese of Troyes. Thomas of Ely, who wrote a chronicle, was a monk of Ely. Jocelyn of Brakeland was a monk of Bury St. Edmunds. William Newburgh was an Augustinian monk. Roger of Hovedon was at one time under vows, since he was employed to go from one abbey to another, as a kind of visitor or receiver. Benedict, author of a chronicle, was abbot of Peterborough. Ralph de Deisto was dean of St. Paul's. Alexander Neckham was abbot of Cirencester. Gervase, the herdman, was a monk of Canterbury. Robert Halcott, theologian, was a Dominican. This long list, which might be enlarged, is sufficient to prove that the pursuit of learning was encouraged and held in honor in the monasteries. A few of the names quoted above are those of scholars. Most of them are the names of chroniclers, and many of contemporary chroniclers. Now the practice followed in one house was observed in every other house obedient to the same rule. If at St. Albans we find one monk after another writing contemporary history, it is reasonable to suppose that at Westminster and at Holy Trinity Priory and at Bermondsey, other monks were employing their time in similar pursuits. We do not, in other words, hear of many learned men coming from the London houses, but since it is certain that at other houses of the same rule there were scholars and writers, since it is certain, for instance, that the Dominicans produced fiery champions for the true faith, since further, it is certain that some of the greatest men of learning were Franciscans, it seems childish to doubt that the same studies, the same incentives to study, were found in the London houses. Further, out of the great mass of learned doctors, monks and friars who preached, wrote, and disputed at Oxford, Cambridge, and elsewhere, since only one or two names have survived, there should be little cause for surprise if, for any given house, not one single man should survive of all those who adorned the rule, and advanced its name for learning during the long centuries of its existence. We must remember that although the monks and friars were savagely attacked for pride, luxury, and incontinence, their enemies seldom ventured to attack them for lack of interest in learning or zeal for study. If it is true that the learned and studious life had become discouraged, or had been allowed to die out, which I cannot believe, there would have been this additional crime alleged against them. Stanley mildly laments that he can find no mention of any great scholar among the Benedictines of St. Peter's. The same lament may, with equal justice, be made over the houses of Bermondsey, the Holy Trinity, the Cistercians of Eastminster, and any other London house. Nay, a similar lament may be made over many a college of Oxford and Cambridge in the present century, where, with every possible encouragement to learning, so few great scholars can be found belonging to any single college. I imagine that these desks, these closed cabins in the North Cloister, of which we read, where the monks sat and studied, were never empty, generation after generation. There must always have been some to whom the quiet of the cloister was a special gift of heaven enabling them to study, and there must always have been also the majority who had no gift for scholarship. To them was assigned the practical management of the house, or some other work, to save them from vacuity. In truth, for such men as these, the atmosphere of the house was distinctly prejudicial to study, cut up as the day was by service, by forms and rules. And lastly, as regards the monastic learning, we must not forget the masses of papers and parchments destroyed in the dissolution of the houses and the dispersion of the libraries. We do not know, we can have no conception, what treasures were destroyed and scattered. Bale says, to destroy all without consideration is, and will be unto England forever, a most horrible infamy among the grave seniors of other nations. I know a merchante that bought the contents of 2 noble libraries for XL shillings price. A shame it is to be spoken. Thy stuff hath he occupy in the stead of paper by the space of more than these X years. For 800 years the monks of St. Peter's, Westminster, had worked in their cloister. What had they done? Where were the chronicles, the scholastic disputations, the treatises they had compiled? They were never taken out of the library, they never saw the light at all. They were burned when the house perished. In common candor, let us acknowledge that in all these generations of monks some must have done good work. As regards the literature of the people, we are not without specimens of their songs, though these do not date, for the greater part, before the 15th century. Yet London was always a city for music, song, and dancing. Probably the songs that have been preserved for us had older forms. There are the religious songs, as that in the Annunciation, beginning, "Teal, teal, so Murali the shepherds began to blow." There are the moral songs lamenting the vices of the age. "Every man in his degree can say if he avised be." There was more trust in some care than is now in many on. Thys world wise now all changed new. So many men Benny found untrue, that in truth liven but few. Faithful to tryst upon. And the drinking song, "Bringe us in good ale, and bringe us in good ale. For our blessed lady's sake bringe us in good ale. Bringe us in no brown breed, for that is made of bran. Nor bringe us in no wit breed, for therein is no gain. But bringe us in good ale. Bringe us in no buffet, for there is many bonies. But bringe us in good ale, for that goeth down at Anies. And bringe us in good ale." And there were the songs sung in dancing. "Skip it and trip it nimbly, nimbly. Tickle it lustily. Strike up the tabor for the wench's favor. Tickle it lustily. Let us be seen upon Highgate Green, to dance for the honor of Holloway. Since we are come hither let us spare for no leather. To dance for the honor of Holloway." And there is the old song of the folk, the oldest that has come down to us. The pipe plays the air, the tabor beats an accompaniment, the singers march down the street wearing garlands and carrying green branches to welcome the coming of spring. "Sumer is icumen in. Liud sing cuckoo. Groweth said and bloweth med. And springth the WDA new, wood anew. Sing cuckoo. Aw bleedeth after lamb. Louth after cav coo. Bullock sturdeth, buck verdeth. Muri sing cuckoo. Cuckoo, cuckoo, well singeth thir cuckoo. Ni swick thir naver new. Sing cuckoo, cuckoo new, sing cuckoo. Sing cuckoo new." Harley Mis British Museum, 978. There is another side to the connection of London with literature. It was in London that modern English poetry began. Geoffrey Chaucer was born in London, the descendant of a long line of Londoners. Gower lived much in London. Occleve was a Londoner. Lydgate knew London well and lived much in the city. If we were permitted to choose poets to grace the medieval life of London, we could not select four about whom the city could more fitly pride herself than this illustrious company. Lydgate at work. From Ms. in British Museum, Harl, 2278. Just as colleges increased and multiplied at Oxford and Cambridge for students in divinity and arts, so they increased in London, that great university for lawyers. There were inns of court and chancery inns, and an inn of serjeants. Here lived the students of law, of their own private maintenance as being altogether fed either by their places, or their practice, or otherwise by their proper revenue, or exhibition of parents or friend, for that the younger sort were either gentlemen or the sons of gentlemen, or of other more wealthy persons. There were 6 of such colleges. 4 of them were inns of court, viz., the Inner and Middle Temple, Lincoln's Inn, and Gray's Inn. 9 were houses of chancery, viz., Clifford's Inn, Dane's Inn, Furnival's Inn, Barnard's Inn, Staple Inn, Clement's Inn, New Inn, Chester's Inn, and one other whose site is unknown. There was a Serjeant's Inn in Fleet Street, another in Chancery Lane, and a third called Scroop's Inn over against St. Andrew's Church, Holborn. The Serjeant's Inns were only for judges and serjeants. The difference between the houses of court and the houses of chancery was that the former were set apart for students and graduates of law only, while the latter received the officers, attorneys, solicitors, and clerks who followed the court of King's Bench or Common Pleas. Some young students, however, entered a house of chancery first, and then, after having performed the exercises of that house, removed to an inn of court where they studied for 7 years, frequented readings, meetings, boltings, and other learned exercises, including small pleadings before a mock court, and then, but only by the general consent of the benchers who have always been extremely 336 jealous of admission, were called to the upper bar, with permission to practice in the courts and in their chambers. After 14 or 15 years at the least, the barrister might hope to be elected a bencher. From the benchers were chosen readers for each house, from the benchers also were elected the serjeants, and from the serjeants the judges. This observance dates from the time when ecclesiastics ceased to be judges, and when the legal machinery of the country was framed and ordered. The origin of the serjeants is the small body of servants, serjeants of the king, who were learned at law, and were kept in the pay of the king to plead his cases. Some of these serjeants were Italian canonists. There was a great body of ecclesiastical lawyers. The temporal lawyer grew gradually. He was an attorney, that is, he represented someone, or he was a pleader who was allowed to speak on behalf of a client. It was in the reign of Henry Roman III that ecclesiastics ceased to be judges. One supposes that the ecclesiastical lawyer, the canonist, continued to exist and to find plenty of employment. See Appendix Roman 8. Roman 3, the physician. The doctor of physic. From the Ellesmere MS. The advance of medicine, as of all the sciences, was slow indeed during the centuries under consideration. In earlier times, monks were the only physicians. Their modes of cure were principally prayer, holy water, relics, and pilgrimages, but they knew the use of herbs. It was forbidden to ecclesiastics to use fire or knife, in other words, to practice surgery, but they treated wounds. They set broken limbs, and on occasion they let blood. They set up everywhere houses or hospitals for lepers, and in all the greater monastic foundations there were rooms for cupping and bloodletting. At the medical school of Monte Cassino, the relics of St. Matthew were relied upon far more than the teaching of the professors. Sisterhoods or associations of matrons and elderly women studied and practiced obstetrics. Abelard exhorted nuns to learn and practice surgery. Certain orders undertook different branches of medical work. The Johannists and the Brotherhood of St. Mary gave their attention to epidemics and plagues. The Brethren of St. Lazarus treated leprosy, smallpox, and fever. The Brothers of St. Anthony and the Holy Ghost studied St. Anthony's fire, dysentery. The Knights Templars studied ophthalmia. The Knights Hospitallers maintained companies of women as nurses. An operation. From a Ms. in Trinity College, Cambridge. Surgeon operating on the skull. From a Ms. in Trinity College, Cambridge. It was because the physician was at first an ecclesiastic that surgery was separated from medicine. When the physician was a professional person living by the profession, he pretended to hold surgery in contempt and refused to operate at all. Lanfranc, however, insisted that medicine and surgery ought to go together. When Henry V invaded France in 1415, he took with him 13 surgeons, viz. Thomas Morstead and 12 assistants. On his second expedition, he asked the city of London to send him volunteers as assistants. None were forthcoming, and Thomas Morstead was empowered to impress as many assistants as he might require. By this time, the bloodletting and the surgery were entrusted to the barbers, who were forbidden to advertise this part of their work by placing a cup full of blood in the window. For the people for whom a physician was not 338 attainable, there were bone setters and herbalists, the latter of whom, if not the former, are still with us. An alchemist's laboratory. From MS. Ad. in British Museum, 10,302. If the physician of the 9th century believed in relics and holy water, his successor of the 14th century placed his reliance mainly on astrology. He was a learned man. He had read all the authors enumerated by Chaucer. He had also read all that was necessary to make an astrologer. This branch of medical science was of the highest importance. A physician, see Skeat's notes to the Canterbury Tales, must take heed and advise him of a certain thing, that faileth not, nor deceiveth, the which thing the astronomer of Egypt taught, that by conjunction of the moon with stars fortunate cometh dreadful sickness to good end, and with contrary planets falleth the contrary, that is, to evil end. The physician therefore treated his patient with reference to fortunate hours. This was magic natural as opposed to magic forbidden. Also when he framed images of wax for his patient, making them at a fortunate moment. He also understood what were considered the 4 elementary qualities: hot, moist, cold, dry. The mixture of these qualities determined the nature of a man. The physician, it will be observed, did not keep or sell his own drugs. For that purpose he went to the apothecaries, who were distinguished from the physicians chiefly by their 339 ignorance as to the astrological part of medicine they knew, that is, the power and use of the drugs they imported, collected, and sold, but they did not know the proper moment of administering them. The physician observed diet very carefully. He was dressed in a manner which proclaimed the high opinion he entertained of his importance, and he believed in aurum potabile, gold that could be administered as a medicine. In another place, Knight's Tale, Chaucer describes in general terms the medical treatment of the time. Al were they sore why hurt, and namely un. That with a spear was thurled his breast boon. To other wounds and to broken arms. Some had in salves and some had in charms. Pharmacies of herbs and eke save. They dronken. Save salvia is sage, still taken by country people in the form of tea. It was greatly esteemed formerly. Hence the proverb of the school of Salerno, cui moriatur homo dum salvia crescit in horto. And still in another place, the non-knee priest's tale, Chaucer enumerates some herbs in common use. A day or two ye should have digestives. Of worms, ye take your laxatives. Of l'oreal, centora and fumitor. Or ells of Eliber that groweth there. Of catapuse or of gatorsberries. Of herb iv, growing in our yard that Murray is. Peck hem upright as they grow, and eat hem in. On this passage Skeat explains that the gatorsberries were probably the berries of the Greek thorn, Rhamnus catharticus, which in Swedish is the goat berries tree, as, trio and goat as, gate. The catapuse is the caper spurge. Skeat also quotes a passage from Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy on the merits of these herbs. Wormwood, centaury, pennyroyal are likewise magnified and much prescribed, especially in hypochondrian melancholy, and because the spleen and blood are often misaffected in melancholy. I may not omit endive, succory, dandelion, and fumitory, which cleanse the blood. It was the property of every wort or herb to heal a man or to harm him. I have added a few to the list given above. Every herbalist or wise woman knew them and their properties. Betony dispels nightmare, cures sudden giddiness, and prevents drunkenness. Cress cures baldness and scurf. Wood lettuce cures dimness of vision. White poppy sleeplessness. Smearwort fevers. Asterion falling sickness 340. Everfern headache and liver. Chermel. Water lily dysentery. Leekwort bite of adder. Savin or swollen feet. Wood dock stiff joints. 5-leaf sickness and sores. Madder. Waybread worms. In the country house the ladies were all herbalists. In the towns, the herbalist kept a shop for the sale of her roots and flowers and leaves, and was the general practitioner for the craftsmen and their households. Rekiel of the Hist, of Troy, Dicks and Sayings. C. 1471 p. 1477. Caxton's Printing. Chapter 12. Fire, Plague, and Famine. London at that time was built of wood, consequently there was continual danger of fire. This is a commonplace among historians. Let us examine into the statement. There were two great fires in London between the 9th and the 17th centuries, i.e., in 800 years, two fires, which swept the town almost from end to end, namely that of 1135 and that of 1666. Between these two fires there were several others of considerable magnitude, one of which burned down the greater part of Southwark, then no more, then a causeway and an embankment, and another the houses on the bridge, and another which made a large gap among the streets. But there were only these two fires which devoured any considerable part of the city. Yet there was constant danger, we are told. The Couverfew. But was London built of wood? When we speak of a wooden house, we begin to think of a frame house with thin deal planks nailed across, as in the backwoods of Canada. But such was not the way of our ancestors. They erected a frame of massive oaken beams, square and strong. Between the beams they filled up the spaces with plaster, thick and incombustible. There was but one fire in the house of the ordinary citizen, and that was on a thick hearthstone. The hot ashes every night were swept up and placed within a couverfew. The curfew or couverfew was an instrument used in the days when the fire was made upon the flat hearth. It was a bell-shaped vessel with a portion cut off. When it was desired to extinguish the fire, or to preserve some fire in the embers until the next day, the ashes and wood were all raked together at the back of the hearth, and the curfew placed over them. The part cut out enabled the vessel to stand against the wall, so that no air could reach the fire. The specimen from which Groves drew this engraving was in the antiquarian repository. It was 10 inches high, 16 inches broad, and 9 inches deep. It was of copper riveted together, for solder would have melted in the heat. Now such a house as that described above was nearly as safe as a house 342 built with bricks, unless there was some other point of weakness in it. The often repeated edict which ordered the building of every house to be of stone to a certain height was certainly never enforced. Like the rest of the medieval ordinances, it could not be enforced for want of a police. The weak point of the house was often the roof. Sometimes wood of a lighter and cheaper kind was used for the support of the roof, and sometimes, against the laws, the material was even thatch, though generally of tiles. Moreover, one suspects that in the poor quarters, those south of Thames Street, where the narrow lanes still contain a population of working people, the framework was not of oak, but of a more inflammable kind of wood. The danger was not so much from the houses themselves, as from the stores containing oil, tallow, and similarly combustible goods, and from the furnaces and smithies standing about among the houses. Whatever the danger might have been, the fact remains that during 1,000 years there were only two great fires, and but a few others which could be called considerable. And the chief reason why the wooden city was not burned 100 times was that a framework of oak does not readily catch fire. All classes, moreover, were deeply sensible of the danger. In every house, great or small, before going to bed, the householder carefully raked together the embers and covered them with a pot, so that they should not be blown about and should retain their fire till the morning. When, by acts of carelessness, drunkenness, or other mishap, fires did occur, they understood how to stop the spreading of the flames by pulling down the adjoining houses with hooks and grappling irons. There were also laws passed from time to time, with the curious medieval faith in the efficacy of laws without police to enforce them, ordering various preventive measures, and one especially, namely, that partition walls were to be of stone up to a certain height. But it is certain that in the poorer parts the law could not be enforced. Moreover, above this height it was allowable to build in wood, and in addition, the thatched roof, though constantly threatened and ordered to be removed, still remained in obscure places. But it was from plague, of various kinds, that London had more to fear than from fire. There was hardly a generation which neither witnessed nor remembered some visitation of plague, and it was almost always of one type. The outbreak of the 6th century, which overran the whole of the Roman Empire and spared England, perhaps did so because at the time there was scarcely any communication between the island and the continent. The plagues of London followed each other at irregular intervals. Occasionally, as in the 13th century, the city remained a long time without any unusual mortality. At other times, as in the 15th century, plague or pestilence of some kind was continually in the city. The following are the dates of the plagues recorded of London, not including the doubtful one of 430. There were plagues in 343 952, 1094, 1111, 1349, 1361, 1367, 1369, 1407, 1478, 1485, 1499, 1506, 1517 to 1521, during which years the plague was never entirely absent. 1528, 1543, 1551, 1603, 1625, and 1665. That is to say, in 700 years there were about 20 outbreaks of pestilence, an average of one for every 35 years. Although, as stated above, and as can be observed in the list, there were long periods, one of 238 years, without any plague at all. The great pestilence of the 14th century, most fearful, most deadly, most incurable, called the Black Death, the great mortality, which desolated 3 continents, came to us from the east. It is conjectured that the disease was in some way caused by certain strange disturbances of the earth in China, where there were droughts, famines, thunderstorms, torrents of rain, earthquakes, and inundations. In China there was a plague of some kind which carried off, it is said, millions of the people. It was reported that a thick, stinking mist advanced from the east and covered one part of Europe, namely Italy, Hecker's epidemics of the Middle Ages. There were many earthquakes. There was one in January 1348, felt in Greece and Italy, in which castles, churches, houses were overthrown, and villages were swallowed up. The same earthquake was felt in other countries. In Carinthia, 30 villages were overthrown. These earthquakes continued to recur until the year 1360, being felt over the whole of Western and Northern Europe. Fireballs were observed in the heavens, filling the people with terror. There were torrents, floods of rain, with the failure of the harvest so that famine set in. All these things preceded the plague. It broke out in Constantinople, whither it had been brought by the lines of trade from China, India, and Persia, in the year 1347. In the same year it appeared at Cyprus, Sicily, Marseille, and some of the seaports in Italy. Sardinia, Corsica, Majorca were visited in succession. In January 1348 it appeared at Avignon and the south of France. In Florence it appeared in April of the same year. In England it first appeared in the town of Dorchester, whence it spread, but not rapidly, till it reached London in the autumn. It is quite impossible to overestimate the mortality caused by this fearful plague, the worst, certainly, that ever afflicted the human race. The figures, indeed, as given by Hecker, may be mostly disregarded. For instance, in one line he tells us that India was depopulated, and in another that 23 millions perished in all the East. It would take many times 23 millions to depopulate India. Italy is said to have lost half its population. In the city of Padua, 2/3 of the population died. In France, there were places in which only 2 or 3 people remained alive out of a whole village. And so on, one might go on for pages to show the wholesale slaughter caused by the scourge. In England it lasted until August 1349, a period of 10 months. There was a plentiful harvest, but there were no laborers to reap the corn. There was abundance of cattle, but the plague seized 340 for them, and they wandered about without herdsmen until they died. As for London, the disease was beyond the skill of physicians. Very few of those who were attacked recovered. The symptoms were the well-known ones belonging to this virulent disease. We have but a scanty record of London during this most terrible time. We can see, later on, by the history of another plague, how the life of the city was affected by such an event. We shall note the dislocation of the machinery, the stoppage of work and trade, the destitution of the poor, the madness of some, the repentance and contrition of some, the despair of some, the callous fatalism of some, the reckless profligacy of some. See London in the time of the Stuarts. It was no use to fly into the country. The poor country folk were lying dead in every village and almost in every field. One might as well sit down in the house overlooking the city lanes and watch the carrying away of the dead, and wait one's own time. The city churchyards became too crowded to allow any more burials. Then other cemeteries were opened outside the walls. The Bishop of London bought a piece of ground, called No Man's Land, northeast of Smithfield, enclosed it with a brick wall, and gave it to the city for a burial ground. It was called Pardon Churchyard, and lay beyond what is now the north wall of the Charterhouse. After the plague ceased, Pardon Churchyard became the burial place of suicides and executed criminals. Their bodies were carried thither in a cart belonging to the hospital or house of St. John. It was covered with black cloth which had a white cross in front, and was provided with a bell which rang with its jolting. The plague still continuing, Sir Walter Manny bought another piece of ground, adjacent to the Pardon Churchyard, 13 acres in extent. This he enclosed and gave to the city as an additional burial place. He further erected a chapel upon it. This chapel stood somewhere in the middle of Charterhouse Square. On the burial ground, and with 10 acres more of ground, Sir Walter Manny afterwards built the house of the Carthusians. 50,000 people who died of the plague were buried in this ground. The fact was recorded on a stone pillar which stood in the place. See also Vol. Roman 2, pt. Roman 3, ch. Roman 4. Anno Domini 1349, regnant magna pestilentia consecratum fuit hoc coimiterium, in quo et infracepta presentis monasteries sepulta furunt mortuorum corpora, plusquam quinquagentimillia piarter alia multa, ob hinc usque ad presens, quorum animabis propitiator Deus. Amen. These were not the only cemeteries consecrated for the reception of the victims. On the northeast of the tower there lay a piece of ground, perhaps cultivated, perhaps waste, which was bought by a priest named Corey, and given by him to the city, calling it the churchyard of the Holy Trinity. One, Robert Elsing, gave £5 towards enclosing it and building a chapel upon it. Other citizens also assisted, and when the plague was over, King Edward Roman III, mindful of a recent escape in a tempest through the miraculous interposition of the Virgin Mary 345 herself, built here a monastery, and called the house King Edward's Free Chapel of the Blessed Virgin of Grace, in memoriam Gratiarum. The site is long since built over, but I suppose there must have been the memory of that plague associated with the house. Indeed, though the plague went away, it came again in 1361, again in 1367, in 1369, and in 1407. These illustrations may indicate something of the impression made upon the people by this terrible visitation. For such dangers, such bereavements, incline the better class of mind to reflection and to meditation. It is not impossible that the spread of Wycliffe's opinions among the citizens of London may have been partly due to the shock of these successive plagues. The quickening shock which caused those who were able to think to ask if outward forms were really all that made religion. The immediate effect of the Black Death on the continent took many forms. Many thousands were terrified into repentance of sins, many thousands died of sheer terror. Rich men and noble dames gave their gold to monasteries. When the gates were closed to keep out infection, they actually threw their offerings over the walls. Many strange things were done under the influence of this terror. The strangest of all was the Brotherhood of the Flagellants, which sprang directly from the terror caused by the Black Death. It originated in Hungary, and it spread over the whole of Europe except England, where it appeared, as will be seen immediately, once only. The Flagellants marched in procession through the cities with singers at their head. They were clad in somber garments. They wore a kind of mask, or hood, over their eyes. Their heads were bent. They had red crosses on back and breast and hood, and in their hands every man carried a triple scourge tied in knots with points of iron. They sang a hymn as they marched, and at a given signal they stripped to the waist and scourged each other. It was a wonderful mania, and lasted for nearly a quarter of a century. These flagellants fanned into a flame the most fanatical prejudices. They caused a persecution of the Jews, equaled only by that when the hordes of the First Crusade poured across Europe on their way to massacre on the plains of Asia Minor. It seems wonderful that any Jews escaped, for they were murdered, they were burned, and they were banished. In Mayence alone 12,000 were put to death. Wherever the flagellants came, a persecution of the Jews followed, and which has always been observed in the persecution of this race. The more fanatical were their enemies, the more resolute the Jews became. At Esslingen the whole Jewish community burned themselves in their synagogue, an act equaled only by the tragedy of Masada and the tragedy of York. In England at this time we had no Jews. The flagellants, therefore, when they arrived here, which was not till the year 1368, could do no great harm. They were Dutch and a company of 120. They came over, uninvited, with the laudable intention of making London repent. This they tried to effect by marching, as I 346 have described above, every man lustily scourging the man next to him. They must have marched in single file. It would seem, however, as if London was not in the least moved by the appearance of the blood streaming from the backs and shoulders of the Brotherhood. The insular hatred of foreigners probably made the citizens resent this uncalled-for interference with their wickedness. So the flagellants went home again. But the hymn they sang has been preserved. It may be found in Hecker's book, and it is all, like a Salvation Army hymn, based upon the fear of hell fire. Ye that repent your sins draw nigh. From the burning hell we fly. From Satan's wicked company. Where he leads, with pitch he feeds. If we be wise, we then shall flee. Maria, Queen, we trust in thee, to move thy Son to sympathy. Glad news I bring thee, sinful mortal. In heaven Saint Peter keeps the portal. Apply to him with suppliant mien. He bringeth thee before thy Queen. Benignant Michael, bless Saint. Guardian of souls, receive our plaint. Through the Almighty Maker's death, preserve us from the hell beneath. The growing frequency of these terrible visitations of plague in the 15th and 16th centuries shows the insalubrity of the city. That everyday quantities of offal were thrown into the river, and that a stream of blood from the shambles rolled daily down open gutters, mattered very little. London was too small as yet, even with 100,000 people, to do much harm to her noble river. The swans still delighted to float and swim about London Bridge. Salmon came up to be caught in midstream, and even the town ditch, which also received a good deal of the refuse, continued to be full of good fish. There were scavengers, not only the rain, the frost, the sun, the wind, and the kites, but men appointed to do for the householder than what they do now, to remove the refuse. These men were appointed for every ward. Their oath, given by Stowe, seems from its language to belong to the 16th century, but it may be older. Ye shall swear that ye shall well and diligently observe that the pavements in every ward be well and rightfully repaired, and not haunted by the annoyance of the neighbors, and that the ways, streets, and lanes be kept clean from donge and other filth, for the honesty of the city, and that all the chimneys, reredos, and furnaces be made of stone, for defense of fire, and if ye know of any such ye shall show it to the alderman, that he may make due redress therefor. And this ye shall not leave. So help you God and by this book. It is not what is thrown into a great tidal river from a town that corrupts the town, nor is it what is thrown upon a lay stall there to lie for a few days until it is taken away. It is what sinks into the earth and slowly spreads around, corrupting all 347 the springs and wells, and causing exhalations in times of heat and moisture. The greatest difficulty of cities has always been the disposal of waste matter, solid and liquid. For nearly 2,000 years, the lower part of the city, the most densely populated part, was dotted with latrines and cesspools. The whole soil of the city was soaked and permeated and corrupted with the pestiferous stuff. The ground gave off a poisoned breath. When the plague came, this poison encouraged it, helped it along, spread it, and strengthened it. We have had no plague for more than 200 years. Perhaps the reason has been that the fire of London in 1666 not only baked and calcined the ground with its heat for many feet deep, burning up the dead bodies which rested 3 or 4 feet below the surface, with the coffins, bones, and deadly poisonous soil of the churchyards, but also choking up the city wells, which were never again opened, and burning the whole of the soil decayed with the impurities of 2,000 years. The fire baked the earth and cleansed it, and destroyed its exhalations for many feet below the surface. When the folk came back again they found, though they knew it not, the ground cleaner than it had been for 2,000 years. As clean as when the solitary elk stood upon the edge of the cliff and looked out upon the broad lagoon of the river at high tide. The people began at once to restore, as much as they could, the old state of things. The cesspools came back and remained for 150 years, but not the wells. In the 200 years that have passed, it has been impossible to restore completely the mischievous conditions due to 2,000 years of filth. There was another horrible method of poisoning the ground, and therefore the air, namely the practice of burying in tiny churchyards, crowded with the dreadful dead, not yet restored to the dust and ashes from whence they came. The fire, as I have said, restored the churchyards to their pristine purity of soil. The people, in this respect as well, for they learned nothing, did their best to restore the old conditions. As the population increased, they nearly succeeded. The revelations of Dr. Walker in 1843 made the world shudder at the enormities daily committed. This, too, we have altered. The crowded, stinking churchyard is now a tiny spot of green with a tree in it, and a bench and a border of flowers. Only we may note that while we have cleaned out and filled up cesspools, and stopped the burial of the dead in our midst, and ceased to drink well water, we have arranged for the introduction into the soil of a new, and perhaps equally fatal poison. The earth is now black and reeking with gas. It is, perhaps, a scientifically interesting point to learn how long it will be before the atmosphere, charged with gas, which all our millions breathe, will encourage or develop another pestilence. And it will be a much more costly business to burn down all London once more in the 20th than it was in the 17th century in order to purge and purify the soil again. The next great danger always hanging over the city was that of famine. The 348 uncertain character of our climate, the occurrence of long rains, untimely frost, summer with no warmth or sunshine, blight and murrain, the ravages of war and especially of civil war, the devastation caused by plague and pestilence, the difficulty of importing grain from abroad, all these causes conspired to make famine an ever-present danger. Terrible famines are reported to have happened in the 3rd and 4th centuries. There were pestilences which accompanied times of great scarcity. In the year 1086 there was a famine, in 1150 there was a great dearth in London. another in 1195, another in 1257. The worst famine ever experienced by London was that of the year 1315-16, CP 51. It came after a succession of wet seasons and bad harvests, and nothing in the history of famines can be worse than the horrors of those 2 years. People lay out in the open streets and on the highways dying of starvation, they and their children. Men fought for food everywhere. There were stories of mothers devouring their own offspring, the prisoners in the jails murdered and devoured each other. Another terrible famine occurred in the year 1338. London, however, felt it little because the mayor imported grain from Prussia. Outside London, the people were making bread out of ivy berries and fern roots. Chapter 13. Crime and Punishment. Prisoner being sentenced and taken to execution. From Ms. in British Museum, Harl, 4375. In Saxon London, we have to consider the amazing ferocity of the punishments and the severity of the penance ordered though evaded, but in this era we may be surprised at the comparative mildness of the medieval punishments. Criminals were hanged, it is true, with greater frequency than at present. They were also sometimes sentenced to have their right hands lopped off, but the alderman was generally present and ready to pardon the offenders on submission. Chiefly we read of pillory and stocks. If a second or third offense, pillory with banishment from the city. The stocks were also a favorite form of punishment, being a kind of pillory. They were for the most part movable stocks, just 2 beams laid alongside each 350 other with holes for the feet. Sometimes there was a ducking stool, sometimes a rogue was clapped in. Prison, a noisome, stinking place full of fever. In extreme cases, he was put on penance, that is bread and water, until he died. Of burning there were few examples until the reign of Henry v. Margaret Jourdain. The witch who assisted Eleanor Cobham was burned. Murder, burglary, and highway robbery were punished by hanging. Runaway laborers were branded. Sacrilege or rape was punished by hanging. Child stealing, a common offense, scolding, and other offenses of women were punished by the stocks. The punishment of women by drowning was practiced in very early times by the ancient Germans and Anglo-Saxons. It was continued down to the middle of the 15th century, when it was finally, but not formally, abolished. But women were drowned on the continent in the 18th century. Among the Anglo-Saxons, women who were convicted of theft were thrown over a cliff into the sea or submerged in any piece of water, stones being tied round the neck. The London places of execution were the Thames and the pools of St. Giles, Smithfield, St. Thomas Watering, and Tyburn. Sometimes the criminal was sewn up in a sack with a snake, a dog, an ape, but where did they get that ape? And a cock. In the 10th century, a woman was thrown from London Bridge into the Thames. In the year 1200, a woman of Southfleet was drowned for stealing cloth, and in the year 1244, Anne of Lodbury, was drowned in St. Giles Pool. In the reign of Henry Roman III, the penalty of drowning began to be changed for that of hanging. One woman, Ivella de Balsham, in that reign was pardoned because, although hanged on Monday at the 9th hour, she was found living on Tuesday at sunrise. It was thought a great innovation when women were first hanged at Paris, and when it was begun, in the reign of Charles Roman VII. A great concourse of people, especially of women, flocked together to witness it. La dite femme pendu tout dishevelée revestu d'une longue robe saint d'une corde sur les jambes, joint ensemble au-dessous de genoux. In Burgundy they suffocated the adulterous woman in mud. At Hastings and Winchelsea they had no other form of capital punishment. Burying alive was sometimes, but seldom, practiced. On one occasion a party of English soldiers at the siege of Meaux by Henry V. were cut off, and they were all killed except one man, who escaped by flight. The king caused him to be buried alive with his dead companions. At Sandwich there was a place called Thieves' Down, where criminals were formerly buried alive. Treason has always, in every country, been punished by death. No crime, indeed, has ever affected men's minds with so much horror and indignation. The English method is well known. The criminal was first hanged by the neck, but not until he was dead. In many cases he was only allowed to swing to and fro once or twice, and was then taken down, before he was insensible, to undergo the more 351 terrible part of his punishment. He was stripped naked, and lines were marked or pricked over his body as a guide to the hangman's knife. The first cut of the knife deprived him of his manhood. The next slashed open his body. His bowels were then taken out and burned before his eyes, if the poor wretch had any longer eyes to see. His heart was torn out. He was then dismembered and his head taken off. Head, limbs, and trunk were set up in different places. In one case on record, a pardon arrived just in time when the men had already been hanged, cut down, stripped naked, and pricked all over for the hangman's knife. and were lying in a row waiting for the last agonies. The hangman refused to give them back their clothes, and they walked home as they were. The debtors' prison for citizens and freemen of the city was Ludgate. Thither were sent those debtors sentenced to prison by the mayor, aldermen, sheriffs, or chamberlain. It appears that they were to stay in prison until they paid their debts. Ludgate was assigned by charity to the poor freemen of the city. It was thought that they would be more happy by themselves than with strangers in Newgate. At one time, however, the debtors made a bad use of this clemency by conspiring together to invent charges against innocent men. They accused aldermen, for instance, of treason and other things. Instead of taking measures to prevent these practices by the punishment of the malefactors, King Henry V was advised to abolish the prison altogether and to remove the prisoners to Newgate. There's so many of them died that, in the same year, the survivors were all taken back again to their old quarters. The fact that they were prisoners for life appears in the ordinance for abolishing the prison. It says that the prisoners ought to dwell in quiet, pray for their benefactors, live upon the alms of the people, and, in increase of their merits, by benign sufferance, in such imprisonment pass all their lives, if God should provide no other remedy for them. Of punishments Holinshed gives what we may assume to be a complete account. There was no torture, the country neither broke on the wheel nor with the bar. For high treason the offender, if a commoner, was hanged, drawn, and quartered, as we have seen. If a nobleman, he was beheaded. For felony, manslaughter, piracy, murder, and rape, hanging was the penalty. In heinous cases the body was hanged in chains. A very large number of crimes came under the head of felony, which was a capital offence. Thus it was felony to carry horses or mares into Scotland. It was felony to steal hawks' eggs. It was felony to practice sorcery, witchcraft, or the digging up of crosses. For poisoning, a crime held in the deepest abhorrence, a woman was to be burned alive. A man was to be boiled alive, either in water, oil, or lead. There was one case recorded of boiling alive in water, but none that I know of boiling in lead. Boiling in oil was conducted by tying the wretched criminal to a pole and slowly lowering him, feet first, into the awful cauldron. Perjury was punished by pillory, and by branding on the forehead 352 with the letter P. Those who uttered seditious words had their ears cut off. Sheep stealers had their hands struck off. Heretics were burned alive. Disorderly women were put in pillory or stocks and stood in streets. They were also carted and ducked. The knight marshal had the power of dragging a malefactor, man or woman, behind his boat across the river between Lambeth and Westminster. Rogues and vagabonds were stalked and whipped. Scolds were ducked. Pirates and robbers were hanged at low water on the bank, and suffered to hang there till 3 tides had flowed over them. Holinshed mentions as well a very strange custom. One wonders if it was ever really practiced. If any man living beside a river wall or sea wall should suffer the wall to decay, he was apprehended, condemned, and staked in the breach, to form part of the foundation of the new wall to be erected thereon. Harrison corroborates the statement. Here are some of the crimes for which pillory was ordered as a punishment: adulteration of wine, pretending to be one of the king's purveyors; short measure, pretending to be a summoner of the archbishop; selling putrid fish, forging letters and seals, pretending to be a collector for the hospital of Bethlehem; stealing a baselard, 12 stealing a leg of mutton, forging title deeds; slandering the sheriff, selling bad pigeons, insulting the recorder, raising price of wheat, spreading false reports, putting iron in a loaf to make it weigh heavy; bringing false accusations, procuring, using false dice, selling counterfeit goods or bad goods of any kind; short weight, magic, fortune-telling. The city of London, except when the mayor sat on a justiciary at the jail delivery of Newgate, had not to deal with capital offences. It was in excess of his powers when a certain mayor caused 2 rioters, who had insulted and assaulted him, to be beheaded. The king was out of England, and the mayor reported the case to him for his approval, which was very cordially granted. The offences punished by the city authorities were chiefly of the petty cheateries enumerated above. Aldersgate was let as a place of residence to the common sergeant. Cripplegate, on the other hand, was let to John Watling, the sergeant and common crier, on the condition of keeping there all the prisoners who might be sent by the mayor and aldermen. The case of Thomas de Albertis is curious and unsatisfactory. He was a man of repute, and apparently of some wealth, living in the parish of St. Swithin. The accusation against him was as follows. In the year 1415 Thomas sent one, Michael Petton, an alien and broker, to the shop of William Barry, mercer in Soper Lane, now Queen Street, on the pretence that the French king, then prisoner, wanted a certain cloth of gold. William Barry showed the cloth of gold, of which Michael agreed to buy 4 pieces at £150, and, he said 353, if you will send the goods to Thomas de Albertis, he will pay for them on delivery. William Barry sent the goods by a servant, who was accompanied by Michael. When they arrived at Thomas de Alberti's house, they were received by the butler, who said that his master was out, this being part of the conspiracy. So the servant left the cloth of gold, and Michael, as had been arranged, went to take sanctuary at the house of the minoresses outside Aldgate, while Thomas returned and took possession of the cloth without paying for it. Thomas was tried by a jury, half Englishmen, half aliens, which shows that he was an alien, and found guilty. They sentenced him to 3 appearances in the pillory, but on the intercession of certain reputable merchants, the punishment was commuted into a fine of £20. The story on the face of it is quite inconsistent with truth. First, what was Michael Petton to get out of it? And next, how should a man of position lend himself to a conspiracy certain to be exposed? But the story shows that there were ingenious rogues in the London of the 15th century. The minute laws which regulated everything betray the absence of police for the enforcement of those laws. A town which possessed a police would never venture to pass rules which the most efficient police could never enforce. Thus, to take some of the regulations almost at random, it will be seen that there could not possibly be any method of enforcing them. Sergeants and other officers were not allowed to take Christmas gifts. So, in the same way, in the early days of the railway, guards and porters were forbidden to take tips. Yet see what has come of that rule. It was forbidden to go about the streets mumming or disguised or acting at Christmas. The people were to make merry at home, but one could not make merry at home. There must be a company gathered together. Besides, what was Christmas without its mummers? Also at Christmas time, every house was to hang out a lantern. And who was to go about the streets to enforce this rule? Then, as we have seen, the prices of things were regulated over and over again, without the least regard to the ordinary rules of supply and demand. It was also ordered, with blind confidence in the power of law, that no man or woman of vicious life should live in the city. Women of loose life were to be known by their hoods, which were to be of ray or striped cloth. It was so perfectly certain that every woman who had lost her virtue would hasten to proclaim the fact publicly. Taverns were to be shut at curfew. Nobody was to walk in the streets after dark. Nobody was to carry arms at night. Boys were not to ask for money for hawking, football, or cock-throwing. All such laws are little more than an expression of opinion. They were repeated over and over again. Offenders, no doubt, retired for a time, a week or two. Then they came out again. For not even an effective police can make a city virtuous, honest, and sober. Nothing will do this except public opinion, the opinion of the whole people, and the city of London was as far from that public opinion formerly as it is now. Occasionally, the law made itself felt in unexpected strength. Thus, when John Jedany, draper, refused to be alderman, they shut up his shop and confiscated his chattels until he changed his mind. And there was the case of the priest who bought a man's wife. The mayor could not punish him, because the bishop alone had the power of punishing a priest, but he could, and did, order that no one in the city should employ him in any spiritual office whatever. And as regards the observance of prices according to regulations, there was one case, at least, in which women were sent to prison for refusing to sell at the ordered price. The arm of the law, moreover, proved long enough to catch William Blakeney, shuttlemaker, after 6 long years, during which he had enjoyed a pleasant and profitable time as a pilgrim. He dressed for the part with bare feet and long hair and a pilgrim's staff. According to his own account, he had been to Jerusalem, Rome, Venice, and Seville, and the good people were never tired of listening to his adventures and experiences. They were never tired, in addition, of giving him food and drink. But he was found at last, and he was paraded about the streets in a cart with a whetstone round his neck to show that he was a liar, and was then put in pillory. A more serious offense was that of William Picamile. He pretended to be a messenger of the king. In this disguise he called upon the Countess of Bedford, and upon the Countess of Norfolk, carrying the command of the king that these ladies should join the court at Leeds Castle in Kent. In return for this gracious royal command, William received rich rewards. This man was found out, tried, and sentenced first to pillory, then to prison during the king's pleasure, and then to banishment from the city. In connection with the writings, about London in carts and on horseback, with the face to the animal's tail, with music to invite attention, with pillory for greater publicity, with the offense written on a placard hung upon the criminal's neck, sometimes with the actual matter of offense tied round his neck, as in the case of that chain of putrid smelts forming a necklace for the vendor. Were the attentions of the people confined to jeers and derision and hooting? When one stood in the pillory were things thrown? I am inclined to think that the pelting was always possible, but uncommon, because it is mentioned occasionally as having happened. Had it been customary, it would not have been mentioned. Thus, in November 1553, a certain profligate priest, or parson, rector of St. Nicholas Cole Abbey, sold his wife to a butcher. It was a time when all priests who regarded their safety made haste to put away their wives. That was pardonable, but to make money by the sad necessity was not well thought of. Therefore Parson Chicken, that was his nickname, was carried round London in a cart. A second time this worthy priest was taken round, for assisting an old acquaintance in a ditch. I do not understand the nature of the offense. On this occasion, it is noted that the popular indignation showed itself in the hurling of rotten eggs at the man's head, and the emptying of vessels upon him from the windows as he passed. Another case is that of Perkin Warbeck. He sat in stocks for a whole day before Westminster Hall, and also in Cheapside. He received, we learn, numberless scorns, reproaches, and jibes, but nothing is said of any personal ill usage. The Tun, Cornhill. E. Gardner's collection. The description of the prison on Cornhill, called the Tun, which was of the kind elsewhere called a clink, and consisted of one strong room above and one below, gives Stowe an opportunity of enlarging upon punishments and offenders. Thus to the Tun were committed night walkers and persons suspected or proved of incontinence. In the mayoralty of John of Northampton in 1383, the citizens, taking into their own hands the rights belonging to the bishop, imprisoned a number of unchaste women in the Tun, and then bringing them out to be seen by all the people, cut off their hair and carried them about the city with trumpets and pipes. And they used the men who were guilty of the like offense in the same way. This public shame seems to have been felt as the greatest ignominy possible. There is indeed a case on record in which 3 persons, notorious ringleaders of false inquests, i.e. persons who take money to be put in the jury and run to be made foremen in certain cases, who were led about the city with papers on their heads and their faces to the horse's tail, actually died of shame. And now, says Stowe, for the punishments of priests in my youth, one note and no more. John Atwad, draper, dwelling in the parish of St. Michael upon Cornhill, directly against the church, having a proper woman to his wife, such an one as seemed the holiest among 1,000, had also a lusty chantry priest, of the said parish church, repairing to his house. With the which priest the said Atwad would sometimes after supper play a game at tables for a pint of ale. It chanced on a time, having haste of work, and his game proving long, he left his wife to play it out, and went down to his shop, but returning to fetch a pressing iron, he found such play to his misliking, that he forced the priest to leap out at a window over the penthouse into the street, and so to run to his lodging in the churchyard. Atwad and his wife were soon reconciled, so that he would not suffer her to be called in question. But the priest being apprehended and committed, I saw his punishment to be thus. He was on 3 market days conveyed through the high street and markets of the city with a paper on his head, wherein was written his trespass. The first day he rode in a cart, the second on a horse, his face to the horse's tail, the third led betwixt twain, and every day rung with basins, and proclamations made of his fact at every turning of the street, as also before John Atwad's stall, and the church door of his service, where he lost his chantry of 20 nobles a year, and was banished the city forever. The Scold's bridal in Walton-on-Thames Church. From What to See in England, Gordon Home. So much is said about the scolding wife, the shrew, the brawling woman, that one would incline to think either that women have changed, or that some special conditions of the time tended to produce this variety of woman. Everywhere it was found necessary to punish her by the cucking stool, which was a punishment belonging to the law of the land. The woman was tied in it and dipped, head over ears, and the punishment was carried on in some parts of the country as late as the last century. There was, however, another and a more ignominious form of punishment, if possible, than the cucking stool. This was the brank, or the branks, or the pair of branks, consisting of a light iron frame which was fitted on the head with an iron tongue to be placed in the mouth. There were many varieties of this, but the principle was the same. The woman fitted with this headgear was either marched up and down the streets, or carried about in a cart, or placed on a stage in a kind of pillory. It has been suggested that probably the woman, who became so violent that this punishment was thought necessary, was suffering from some kind of excited brain. It is also possible that domestic misfortunes may have ruined a woman's temper, a bodily pain, or excessive work. When life is easy, and there are no vexations or sufferings, there are few scolds. In the year 1640, or thereabouts, one, John Willis, deposed that he had seen a scold driven through the streets of Newcastle with a brank upon her head. In this town, there used also to parade a drunkard walking in a cask which came down to his knees. At Worcester, Ludlow, Newcastle-under-Lyme, Oxford, Shrewsbury, Walsall, Lichfield, Walton-on-Thames, and many other places, there are also branks preserved, I believe, to this day. At Bolton-le-Moor, the brank was used for the punishment of women of bad character. Let us, from the annals of medieval crime, extract a few illustrations of medieval punishment. Since the greatest possible offense that can be committed against the state is treason, I begin with the most remarkable case of high treason that can be found in our history. It occurred in the year 1295. The traitor was one Thomas Turberville, knight. He was taken prisoner by the French at the siege of Rheims. While a prisoner, he was induced to engage himself to convey information to the French as to what was going on in England. Probably poverty, perhaps revenge, made him consent to this shameful undertaking. He gave 2 sons as hostages to the provost of Paris and came over to England pretending that he had escaped. He was favorably received by the king, and such confidence was reposed in him as might be expected for an honorable and gallant soldier who had done good service. In consequence of this confidence, he was able to convey to the French information which enabled them to effect a landing at Hythe, Dover, and other parts of the kingdom. Then he went into Wales on this service, and engaged the Welsh to rise at the same time as the Scots. He sent his letters by a secret messenger, who contrived to travel without suspicion as belonging to the train or following of ambassador or cardinal. On one occasion, however, the messenger betrayed him, and instead of carrying the letters to Paris, took them straight to the king, before whom he laid open the whole villainy of Sir Thomas Turberville. The principal letter left no doubt possible. It was that of a self-confessed, double-dyed villain. It was as follows. To the noble Baron and Lord Provost of Paris, sweet sire, at the wood of Vishens, his liege man at his hands, greeting. Dear sire, know that I am come to the court of the King of England, sound and hearty. And I found the king at London, and he asked much news of me, of which I told him the best that I knew. And know that I found the land of Wales in peace, wherefore I did not dare to deliver unto Morgan, thing which you well wot of. And know that the king has fully granted peace and truce. But be you careful and well advised to take no truce, if the same be not to your great advantage. And know that if you make no truce, great advantage will accrue unto you, and this you may say to the high lord. And know that I found Sir John Fitz-Thomas at the king's court, for the purpose of treating of peace between him and the Earl of Nishal as to the earldom of Ulvester. But I do not yet know how the business will turn out, as this letter was written the day after that the cardinals had been answered. Wherefore I dare not touch at all upon the business that concerns you. And know that there is little watch kept on the sea-coast towards the south. And know that the Isle of Wight is without garrison. And know that the king is sending into Almain 2 bishops and 2 barons to speak to, and to counsel with, the king of Almain as to this war. And know that the king is sending into Gascony 20 ships laden with wheat and oats, and with other provisions, and a large sum of money. And Sir Edmund, the king's brother, will go thither, and the Earl of Nishal, Sir Hugh le Despencer, the Earl of Warwick, and many other good folks. And this you may tell to the high lord. And know that we think we have enough to do against those of Scotland. And if those of Scotland rise against the King of England, the Welsh will rise also. And this I have well contrived, and Morgan has fully covenanted with me to that effect. Wherefore I counsel you forthwith to send great persons into Scotland, for if you can enter therein, you will have gained it forever. And if you will that I should go thither, send word to the King of Scotland, that he find for me and all my people at their charges honorably. But be you well advised whether you will that I should go thither or not. For I think that I shall act more for your advantage by waiting at the king's court, to espy and learn by inquiry such news as may be for you. For all that I can learn by inquiry, I will let you know. And send to me Perrault, who was my keeper in the prison where I was. For to him I shall say such things as I shall know from henceforth, and by him I will send you the matters that I fully ascertain. And for the sake of God, I pray you that you will remember and be advised of the promises that you made me on behalf of the High Lord, that is to say, 100 livers of land to me and my heirs. And for the sake of God, I pray you on behalf of my children, that they may have no want so long as they are in your keeping, in meat or in drink or other sustenance. And for the sake of God, I pray you that you be advised how I may be paid here. For I have nothing, as I have lost all, as well on this side as on the other. And nothing have I from you, except your great loyalty, in which I greatly trust. Confide fearlessly in the bearer of this letter, and show him courtesy. And know that I am in great fear and in great dread, for some folks entertain suspicion against me, because I have said that I have escaped from prison. Inform me as to your wishes in all things. Unto God I commend you, and may he have you in his keeping. The traitor was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. A week later he expiated his crime as follows. He came from the tower, mounted on a poor hack in a coat of ray, and shod with white shoes, his head being covered with a hood and his feet tied beneath the horse's belly and his hands tied before him. And around him were riding 6 torturers attired in the form of the devil, one of whom held his rein, and the hangman his halter, for the horse which bore him had them both upon it. And in such manner was he led from the Tower through London to Westminster, and was condemned on the dais in the great hall there. And Sir Roger Brabazon pronounced judgment upon him, that he should be drawn and hanged, and that he should hang so long as anything should be left whole of him. And he was drawn on a fresh ox hide from Westminster to the conduit of London, and then back to the gallows, and there is he hung by a chain of iron, and will hang, so long as anything of him remain. Understand what was meant by all these details. They were partly to make him undergo the greatest humiliations possible, partly to teach the people what was meant by high treason. First, he had been a noble knight, therefore he must ride, but on a wretched hack. Next, he had been a gallant soldier, therefore he must wear a helmet, but it was a monk's hood. Thirdly, as a soldier he must have a coat of mail, but it was of the poorest and commonest striped cloth, such as used to mark the trade of a prostitute. Fourthly, instead of a soldier's boots, he wore the white shoes of a scullion. Fifthly, so that no one could doubt what would be his fate after death, the devils had already got him. And since he was to be drawn to his place of hanging, let the journey be as long as possible, viz., from Westminster to the middle of Cheapside, and then by Newgate to the gallows at the Elms at Smithfield. And since the ordinary hurdle as used for murderers and housebreakers is far too good for him, therefore let him be drawn on the gory and bleeding hide freshly stripped from the carcase. And finally, let him hang as long as anything remains of him to hang, for all the world to see, and for all the world to execrate. Another memorable punishment was that of Sir Robert Tressilian, Lord Chief Justice of Richard Roman II, who was hanged with Sir Nicholas Brember and others. The method of his punishment illustrates the curious mixture of barbarity and of pity which characterized the time. His judges were anxious to inflict upon him the greatest possible amount of ignominy, and at the same time not to destroy his soul. He was therefore drawn on a hurdle all the way from the Tower of London to Tyburn, and with some humanity they allowed him to rest at the end of each furlong, in order that he might confess with the friar who accompanied him. When, however, he arrived at Tyburn, he refused absolutely to go up the ladder which led to the gallows. Then they proceeded to beat him with clubs. Remember, this man had been Lord Chief Justice, and he finally consented to climb the ladder. When he stood upon 360, the scaffold, he turned to the hangman and said, "You cannot hang me as long as I have got anything on." Thereupon they took off his clothes and found in his pockets certain charms with which he had provided himself against a violent death. Having thus removed the charms, they proceeded to hang him naked, and he was left hanging for the next 24 hours. The prisons of London were those of the Tower, for persons accused of high treason, Newgate, Ludgate, and the Fleet. The chambers over the gates of the city were, as we have seen, also used as prisons, and the gate in Westminster leading from the Abbey to Tothill Fields. There were also places of confinement of a temporary kind, such as the Tun in Cornhill. Every liberty, again, had its own prison, as, for instance, St. Catherine by the Tower, and its own court. Every monastery also had its own prison for offending brethren. The ordinary prison consisted of 2 rooms, one below the other, constructed of stone, with very strong and thick woodwork. This was protected by being everywhere covered with strong square-headed nails. The windows had iron gratings. The heavy doors were studded with nails. The lower room, which was the kitchen as well as the living room, and a sleeping room when the prison was crowded, had a great fireplace, the chimney being strongly barred above to prevent escape that way. There was outside a very small courtyard for air and exercise. The Fleet prison, which was outside the wall, was surrounded by a narrow fosse forming a branch of the Fleet River. The arrangement of the room above and the room below was, of course, modified when it became necessary to enlarge prisons and to provide for the separate accommodation of women. When we speak of crime and punishment, we are forced to speak of vagrants and rogues. Below the busy and honest life of industry, hidden away in the holes and corners of the labyrinthine city, was the life of the rogues, the vagrants, the masterless men. If anything were wanted to prove the ever-present existence of this population, one need only read the proclamations and acts passed from time to time. Every outbreak of foreign or civil war added to the number of those who, once being taken from their work, would never return to it, and so became tramps, highway robbers, common thieves. The nomad instinct provides another contingent of those who cannot or will not work. The criminal whom no one will employ furnishes a third contingent. The prodigal son, who yearns and longs for the life of unrestraint with women, drink, feasting, and singing, furnishes another contingent. All these people found a harbor with congenial society in the Plantagenet times, as they do now in and about the city of London. If they were not within the walls, they were not far without, in Clerkenwell, in Southwark, and in Westminster. The laws for the repression of vagrancy and robbery were sound and strong. If they could have been enforced, vagrants and highway robbers would have disappeared. For the Saxon system of frank pledge provided that the hundred, or the tithing 361, should be responsible for every crime committed within its borders. Further, if a man entertained a guest for more than 2 nights, he became liable for that guest. Yet without the goodwill of the people, what is the use of laws? Who could enforce these laws? Robin Hood, Adam Bell, Clym of the Clough, and William of Cloudesley were popular heroes. As for vagrants, it was notorious that thousands were driven to vagrancy to escape starvation, through the tyrannous exactions of the overlord, or through the hard forest laws. Another cause of vagrancy was that which remains in force to this day, the encouragement of beggars by giving them alms. There were places dotted all over the country, not monasteries only but castles and houses, where there were endowments and doles on certain days of the year. These days, of course, were perfectly well known to the tramp. The Statute of Winchester, AD 1285, makes it plain that the sympathies of the people were with the tramp and highway robber. It was enacted in this statute that there were to be stationed 6 men at every gate of the city, that the gate was to be closed from sunset to sunrise, and that the watch should arrest every suspicious person. This statute was to be enforced in every town, but in London, it was further ordered that after curfew tolled at St. Martin le Grand, no man should go about the city streets armed, nor should he go about the streets at all unless he be a great man or other lawful person of good repute, or their certain messenger. And whereas offenders do commonly meet and talk in taverns, it was enacted that every tavern should be closed at curfew, under penalties, the last and chief of which was to be forejudged of his trade. Again, who was to enforce these laws? What police were there to arrest night walkers? Who was to ascertain whether a tavern was closed or not? Accordingly, after the weak rule and troubled time of Edward Roman II, we find his son in 1328 making a proclamation against the granting of charters of pardon for robberies, manslaughters, felonies, etc. Again, 2 years later, it is ordered that if suspicious persons pass by, they may be arrested, either by day or by night, and delivered up to the sheriff, who will judge if they be robards men, wasters, or draw latches. The 3 proclamations, 23 Edward Roman III, 25 Edward Roman IV, and 2 Richard Roman II, concerning labor and vagrancy, forbade absolutely the giving of alms to sturdy beggars. But proclamations availed nothing. The peasants left their villages and wandered about the roads. The men-at-arms wandered with them. The cripples, the blind, the maimed, the mutilated wandered from town to town. The leper walked along with his clack dish. The strolling minstrel walked with them, and they were all rogues and thieves and murderers together. Sometimes they were set in the stocks. How could that have any effect upon a tramp? Shame he had none, trade he had none, employer he had none, vagrancy ran through his veins, there was no other life possible for him. Prison was the only cure for vagrancy, and that, imprisonment for life. Imprisoned 362 meant, however, generally shortened life very quickly. A case is mentioned by Jusserand, Wayfaring Life, p. 366, in which 2 men and 1 woman were imprisoned as vagrants without being charged with any robbery. It was at a place called Thorlestan. One of the men died in prison, the other man lost 1 foot, the woman lost 2 feet by putrefaction. The prison, in fact, was a foul and noisome place, not paved, not cleaned, in which fever always lingered. In the 14th century, there is mentioned for the first time the influx of people from the country into London. In the year 1359, the following proclamation was issued. Forasmuch as many men and women, and others of divers counties, who might work to the help of the common people, have betaken themselves out of their own country to the city of London, and do go about begging there, so as to have their own ease and repose, not wishing to labor or work for their sustenance, to the great damage of such the common people, and also do waste divers alms, which would otherwise be given to many poor folks, such as lepers, blind, halt, and persons oppressed with old age and divers other maladies, to the destruction of the support of the same. We do therefore command on behalf of our Lord the King, whom may God preserve and bless, that all those who go about begging in the said city, and who are able to labor and work for the profit of the common people, shall quit the said city between now and Monday next ensuing. And if any such shall be found begging after the day aforesaid, the same shall be taken and put in the stocks on Cornhill, for half a day the first time, and the second time he shall be taken he shall remain in the stocks 1 whole day, and the third time he shall be taken, and shall remain in prison for 40 days, and then forswear the said city forever. And every constable, and the bedell of every ward of the said city, shall be empowered to arrest such manner of folks, and to put them in the stocks in manner aforesaid. In the vision of Piers Plowman, there is a powerful contrast between the honest laborer and the beggar. In the description of the latter, there is a touch which opens up a wide field of wickedness. They observe, he says, no law, nor marry women with whom they have been connected. They beget bastards who are beggars by nature, and either break the back or some other bone of their little ones, and go begging with them on false pretenses ever after. There are more misshapen children among such beggars than among any other men that walk on the earth. A beggar. From Ramont of the Rose in British Museum. Harl, Ms. 4425. This chapter belongs to the period which ends with the last of the Plantagenets. Yet the legislation of the next century, which was conducted on much the same lines as that of Richard Roman II, and designed to meet the same evils, may be considered here as showing the condition of the city as regards beggars and rogues and persons without a trade. We have seen that order after order, statute after statute, proclamation after proclamation, was passed for the suppression of the rogue 363, who, nevertheless, continually multiplied and thrived. They tried other methods. They ordered 16 beadles of the 4 hospitals, Christ's, Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, and Bridewell, to divide the city between them, taking 6 wards for the party of 4, and to arrest all the beggars of the city. The impotent and the aged, the sick, the lame, the blind they were to take to St. Bartholomew's or St. Thomas's. The children were to be taken to Christ's Hospital. The sturdy beggars and vagabonds were to be taken to Bridewell, where they would receive payment. It need not be explained what was the nature of the remuneration. It is not stated that success attended this measure, but the imagination pictures the sturdy beggar marching out of Bishopsgate, and Newgate, and Ludgate with all possible speed, and with the air of an honest craftsman, while the impotent and the rest of them betook themselves to Southwark. At every gate of the city was planted one of the beadles. It seems an odd service to exact of an hospital officer to watch those who entered and those who went out, and every beadle was to inquire of the collectors in every ward for the houses which harbored vagrants, and these vagrants and sturdy beggars who should be set to work should be attended by a beadle. Strange as it may appear, this method produced no visible decrease in the number of beggars and vagabonds, maimed soldiers, and masterless men, by whom 364 the city was infested. They then made trial of a city police. At first it was a beginning only. They appointed 2 city marshals for the clearance of disorderly persons, whom they had authority to banish. One supposes that they did banish them, but it is certain that they came back again. Yet for a time, the city marshals succeeded. The chief haunts of rogues at this time were the new streets about Clerkenwell and Islington. On one occasion, a great and unexpected search being made in these places, several hundreds were arrested and taken to Bridewell, where they were all flogged and set to work. Yet a few years later, the proclamations against masterless men were out again, with more vigorous search and more arrests and more floggings. This view of low life in London may be concluded with Stowe's account of Mr. Wotton, though in reality he adorned the next century. Among the rest they found out one Wotton, a gentleman born, and sometime a merchant of good credit, but falling by time into decay. This man kept an alehouse at Smartskey near Billingsgate, and after, for some misdemeanor put down, he reared up a new trade of life. And in the same house he procured all the cut-purses about the city to repair to his house. There was a schoolhouse set up, to learn young boys to cut purses. 2 devices were hung up, the one was a pocket, the other was a purse. The pocket had in it certain counters, and was hung about with hawk's bells, and over the top did hang a little sacring bell. The purse had silver in it, and he that could take out a counter without any noise was allowed to be a public foister, and he that could take a piece of silver out of the purse without noise of any of the bells was adjudged a judicial nipper, according to their terms of art. A foister was a pickpocket, a nipper was a pickpurse or cut-purse. In this Wotton's house were written in a table divers poesies, and among the rest this was one. See spy sport, see non-spy tunk steal. Another this. See spy, see non-spy, foist, nip, lift. Shave and spare not. Note that foist is to cut a pocket, nip is to cut a purse, lift is to rob a shop or a gentleman's chamber. Shave is to filch a cloak, a sword, a silver spoon, or such like that is negligently looked into, to which add one phrase more in those times used among this sort, milk and ken, which is to commit a robbery or burglary in the night in a dwelling house. The coroner's rolls from 1270 to 1278 have been preserved and are published by Riley in his memorials. They form a curious collection of cases. Let us go through these inquests of the 13th century. The exact dates do not concern us. John Feuillard and John Leclerc were playing a game called tiles, probably rounded like quoits, on a certain Sunday morning in the churchyard of St. Mary Overwise, the latter being clerk in the church of St. Mary Magdalene. By accident, John Leclerc, in throwing his tile, struck the other so violent a blow on the head that it killed him on the spot. Having done this, John Leclerc ran away to the church, and was no more seen, at all events, till after the inquest. Goods and chattels the clerk had none. The neighbors of the deceased were attached, i.e. bound over to give evidence if called upon. Henry de Flegg, taking his horse to water in the dock of Castle Baynard 365 Ward, was carried out into the river by the animal, and fell off his back and so was drowned. The nearest people to the place where the body was found were attached. In the Tower ward of William de Hadestock, and in the parish of Barkingchurch, one, Gervase de Norreys, was found lying dead. It was ascertained that the deceased was quarreling with one William Lindsay, and that the said William, drawing a knife, gave Gervase 2 wounds, one in the left breast and one in the back, of which wounds he immediately died. William thereupon fled to the church where he remained. The goods of William were seized, but they amounted to nothing more than a tabard short coat, 1 hatchet, a bow with 3 arrows, and 1 shirt, the whole valued at 16 pence. On the Wednesday following, William acknowledged the crime before the chamberlain and sheriffs, and abjured the realm. They gave him 3 days to get to Dover, where he was to take boat across the channel. Henry Green, a water carrier, went down to the river to fill his tankard. The water carrier, sometimes called a cob, carried a vessel, perhaps 2 vessels at a time, called tankards. Henry Green, then, went down to the riverside with his tankard. He stepped into a boat. He filled the tankard and would have gone back to the quay, but the weight of the tankard caused the boat to move backwards, and Henry Green fell in and was drowned. The coroner learned the facts, examined the body, which showed no sign of violence, and appraised the boat and the tankard at 5s. 6d. The valuing of things at an inquest was for deodand or the king's perquisite. It would then appear that the owner of the boat lost it, yet he was not to blame. The theory of the deodand was that the value of the instrument, or cause of the death, was to be given to the king, by him to be offered to God, if he so chose. Another man, name unknown, was found drowned in the fosse of the Tower. The evidence stated that he was seen to take off the coat of russet which he wore, and in a naked state entered the water and sank to the bottom. In the ward of Henry de Coventer, Vintry Ward, Adam Selliot, a servant of Ponce de Moore of St. James Garlichide, was trying to climb a pear tree in the garden, when a branch broke and he fell to the ground, by which fall his whole body was almost burst asunder. The pear tree was valued at 5s, for the deodand. In the parish of St. Brigid, and the ward of Anquetil d'Auvergne, Farringdon Ward, without, an inquest was held on the body of John Lahancrete. The witness said that the said John came from a certain feast that had been held in the city of London to the house of William before named, being very drunk, that is to say, on the Monday before, at the hour of vespers, where he had hired his bed by the day. And that then, intending to lie down upon it, he took a lighted candle for the purpose of making his bed. Which done, he left the candle burning, and fell asleep thereon. And the candle being thus left without anyone to look after it, the flame of it caught the straw of the bed upon which the said John was lying. And accordingly, he, as well as the bed and the straw aforesaid, was burnt, through the flame of the candle so communicating, at about the hour of midnight. And so, languishing from the effects thereof, he lived until the Tuesday following, at the hour of matins, on which day and hour he died from the burning aforesaid. Being asked if they hold anyone suspected of the death of the said John, they say they do not. And the body was viewed, upon which no wound or hurt appeared, save only the burning aforesaid. Roger Canny, on a certain cold night in December, was going home. He had been drinking till curfew at the tavern of Robert Box. He was very drunk when he started. Presently he fell down in the street, and so lay out in the frost and died of the cold. It was stated that he had epilepsy, or a falling sickness, but the falling was probably due to the beer and not to the epilepsy. The inquest on Richard de Paris, challoner, maker of challons or blankets, was of a much more complicated nature. Let us quote Riley's words. The witnesses say that on the preceding Sunday after curfew rung, it happened that one Richard Moyes, going along the King's Highway, came to the door of John le Challoner, next to the house of Agnes de Essex, near Fanchurch, in which house lodged Robert de Munseny and Arnulf, his son, with his household. And so, trying to make entrance therein, he knocked, shouted, and made a noise. On seeing which, 4 of the household aforesaid, who were standing at the hostel of the knights before mentioned, and of whose names they are ignorant, being moved thereat, requested him to cease making his noise and go away. And as he refused to do so, they cried out that he must leave forthwith. Whereupon, hearing the outcry aforesaid, Robert and Arnulf and all of Robert's household came out, that is to say, John de Munseny, son of Robert, John Fontelon, Robert de la Rochelle, Henry de Jings, John Courtois, John de Hacon, John the White, Hugh de Haddon, Hatchard de Garbodesham, and Robert de la Loe, some with swords and some with other arms. And all of them, save only the said Robert, who stood at the door of his hostel, followed the said Richard, who fled to the house of Alice l'Official, in which house many persons were seated drinking, with the door open, among whom were Richard de Paris, now dead, and one Henry Page. And Richard Moyes concealed himself between two wooden vessels there. And the said Arnulf, on entering, met at the door the said Richard de Paris, who cried out, "Who are these people?" Whereupon Arnulf struck him with his drawn sword, already stupefied as he was at the sight of the sword. Then rushing into the house, he gave him a wound in the back, between the ribs of the body, 2 inches 367 in breadth, and penetrating to the intestines, and another small wound under the left breast, from which wounds he languished and survived until the Thursday following, on which day, at the hour of matins, he died. And immediately after perpetrating this felony, Arnulf went forth and joined his accomplices, and they went together to his hostel, John and Hatchard excepted, who took to flight, and there they remained in his house, being asked if they hold anyone else suspected of that death, either in deed or in abetting the same. They say all the persons aforesaid, except the said Robert de Munseny, who was standing at the door of the hostel where he lodged. While this was going on, the said Hatchard and John included, who fled immediately after the felony was committed, were present when the same was committed. No person, however, wounded him, save only the said Arnulf, nor do they hold the said Robert suspected of abetting him. And all of them were taken and imprisoned, except those who took to flight. None of them had any goods or chattels, except the said Robert de Munseny and Arnulf his son, who had 6 horses, 3 beds, 1 falcon, and 3 greyhounds, which are appraised at 20 marks in the whole, and the body was viewed, etc. A hand-to-hand fight. From Ms. in British Museum, Harl, 4374. And the 2 neighbors nearest to the spot where the said Richard de Paris lay dead were attached by sureties, and the 2 neighbors nearest to the spot 368 where he was wounded, and the 2 neighbors nearest to the hostel from which they went forth. And Agnes de Essex was attached, in whose house the said malefactors were lodged, and Alice, her maid-servant. And all the persons were attached, who were in the house where he was wounded. Matilda, wife of Henry le Caffour, came to a tragic end like Roger Canny, through the effects of drink. She was going home very drunk, and she fell and broke her right arm. They carried her to her own home, and she languished for 3 days when she died. Probably there was something else broken as well as the arm. The next is a case of murder with several points of interest. Simon de Winton kept a tavern in Ironmonger Lane. His body was found in a coal cellar in Easter 1278. The facts were these. The said Simon had a servant named Roger de Westminster. On December 7, 1277, the master and his man had a violent quarrel. They carried on the quarrel the whole of the next day. Now they slept in the same room. On the following morning, Roger opened the tavern as usual, set out the benches and sold wine, as if nothing had happened. And as the said Simon had not been seen by the neighbors all that day, they asked Roger what had become of his master, whereupon he made answer that he had gone to Westminster, to recover some debts that were owing to him there, and on the 2nd day and 3rd he gave the same answer. At twilight, however, on the 3rd day, he departed by the outer door, locking it with the key, and carrying off with him a silver cup, a robe, and some bedclothes, which had belonged to the same Simon. Afterwards he returned and threw the key in the house of one Hammond Cook, a near neighbor, telling him that he was going to seek the said Simon, his master, and asking him to give him the key in case he should come back. And from that day the house remained closed and empty until the eve of our Lord's circumcision, January 1 following, upon which day John Dodgett, a taverner, taking with him Gilbert de Colcester, went to the house aforesaid to recover a debt which the said Simon owed to him for wines. But when he found the door closed and locked, he inquired after the key of the neighbors who were standing about. Upon hearing of which, the said Hammond gave him up the key forthwith. Upon entering the tavern with Gilbert aforesaid, he found there 1 tun full of wine, and another half full, which he himself had sold to Simon for 50 shillings. And this he at once ordered to be taken out by porters, namely, Henry Whiting, William Le Whaleys, Ralph Le Ires, Hugh Noteman, and Stephen de Iminge, and put in a cart belonging to Henry Whiting aforesaid, and taken to his own house, for the debt so due to him, together with some small tables, canvas cloths, gallons, and wooden podles, 2 shillings in value. This being done, the said John Dodgett shut the door of the house, carrying away with him the key thereof. from which time the house was empty, no one having entered it until the Tuesday before Palm Sunday, upon which day Master Robert aforesaid, to whom the house belonged, came and broke open the door for want of a key, and so entering it, immediately enfoft Michael le ointer thereof. Which Michael on the Saturday in Easter week went there alone, to examine all the offices belonging thereto, and see which of them required to be cleansed of filth and dust. But when he came to the narrow and dark place aforesaid, he there found the headless body. Upon seeing which, he sent word to the said chamberlain and sheriffs. Being asked if anyone else dwelt in the house, save and except those two persons, or if anyone else had been seen or heard in that house with them on the night the felony was committed, or if any other person had had frequent or especial access to the house by day or night, from which mischief might have arisen, they say, not beyond the usual resort that all persons have to a tavern. Being asked if the said Roger had any well-known or especial friend in the city, or without, to whose house he was wont to resort, they say they understand that he had not, seeing that he was a stranger, and had been in the service of this Simon hardly a fortnight. Being asked therefore whither he had taken the goods he had carried off, they say that, seeing that the house was near to the jury, they believe that he took them to the jury, but to whose house they know not. Being asked what became of the head so cut off, they say they know not, nor can they ascertain anything as to the same. They say also that the said Roger escaped by stealth and has not since been seen. Chattels he had none. In the church of St. Stephen Walbrook, William le Clerc ascended the belfry to look for a pigeon's nest. As he was climbing from beam to beam his feet failed him and he fell, being instantly killed. The beam was appraised at fourpence. In Westcheap, the body of William le Panner, pelterer, was discovered near the conduit. It was found that he had been just weakened by being blooded, so that he fell on his way home and expired on the spot. In Broad Street Ward, the ward of William Bucarel, one Matthew de Heckham was lying dead in the house of Richard le Clerc in Lothbury. The story is curious. Who say that on the Sunday next after the feast of St. Matthew the Apostle, September 21, the said Matthew was going from Braid Street towards the jury, and when he had reached midway between the lane called Icemonger Lane and the Guildhall of London, there met him certain Jews, Abraham de Durkinge, Isaac de Canterbury, and Cress, son of Isaac de Linton. And upon so meeting him, Abraham before named, of malice aforethought, took the said Matthew by the shoulder, and threw him in the mud. And upon his attempting to rise, Isaac before mentioned struck the said Matthew with a certain ainlace a knife or dagger of his below the right shoulder blade, in the loins, inflicting upon him a wound 1 3/70 in breadth and 6 inches deep. After which the said Matthew pursued them, as well as he was able, from the spot before mentioned to the wall of St. Lawrence Jury, where, being too much weakened through excessive loss of blood, he could follow them no farther. But rising from the ground, he went to the house of Richard before named, where he was found. And so, after languishing from the Sunday before named to the Friday next before the feast above mentioned, he died at daybreak on that day. Being asked if they hold any other person or persons suspected, they say no one, except the said Isaac, who gave him the wound from which he died, and that the aforesaid Abraham and Cress were consenting to the felony. Being asked as to the chattels of the felons, they say that they know nothing of them. And the body was viewed, upon which appeared the wound aforesaid, and that most horrible. Nothing is said as to the trial of Abraham, Isaac, and Cress. It was reported that one Gilbert Clope was lying dead on a quay near the Tower. Gilbert was not quite right in his mind. One says he was leaning against a certain wall on London Bridge, and apparently fell asleep, his head and body projecting over the bridge, so that he fell in and was drowned. Henry de Lanfair met his death in a very singular manner. One Richard de Codesfold, having fled to the church of St. Mary Stanage slain in London, by reason of a certain robbery being by one William de London, cutler, imputed to him, and the same William pursuing him on his flight thereto. It so happened that on the night following the day of the invention of the Holy Cross, May 5, in the present year, there being many persons watching about the church aforesaid, to take him, in case he should come out, a certain Henry de Lanfair, ironmonger, one of the persons on the watch, hearing a noise in the church, and thence fearing that the same Richard was about to get out by another part of the church, and so escape through a breach, that there was in a certain glass window therein, went to examine it. The said Richard and one Thomas, the then clerk of that church, perceiving this, the said Thomas, seizing a lance without an iron head, struck at Henry before mentioned through the hole in the window, and wounded him between the nose and the eye, penetrating almost to the brain, from the effects of which wound he languished until the day of St. Dunstan, May 19, when he died, at about the 3rd hour. They say also that as well the said Richard as Thomas before mentioned are guilty of that felony, seeing that Richard was consenting thereto. And the said Thomas was taken, and imprisoned in Newgate, and afterwards delivered before Hammon Houghton, justiciar of Newgate. And the said Richard still keeps himself within the church before named. Being asked if they hold any more persons suspected as to that death, they say they do not. They have no 371 lands or chattels. And the body was viewed, upon which no other injury or wound was found, save only the wound aforesaid. The last of these historiettes is the story of Godfrey de Belstead, and the manner of his death. The before-named Godfrey, on the day of St. Bartholomew, August 24 last past, was coming from Sestrihunt, Cheshunt, towards London, mounted on a hackney hired of a certain man of that village, as they believe, but as to whose name and person they are ignorant, and having one Richard le Lassier in his company, they met certain carters coming from London, with 3 carts, but as to the names and persons of whom they are altogether ignorant. Whereupon, one of the carters aforesaid began most shamefully to abuse the said Godfrey, for riding the said hackney so fast, and a dispute arose between Godfrey and the said Richard, on the one side, and the said carters on the other. One of the carters, seizing with his hands a certain iron fork, struck Godfrey upon the crown of his head, with such force as to inflict a wound 2 inches in length, and penetrating almost to the brain. The other carters also badly beat him all over the body with sticks, and maltreated both him and the said Richard le Lassier, so much so that the latter hardly escaped with his life. Godfrey before named survived from the day of St. Bartholomew to the Thursday before mentioned, languishing from the wound and beating aforesaid, and on that day, at about the 3rd hour, he died. And the body was viewed, upon which was seen the wound aforesaid, and it appeared altogether disfigured from the beating before mentioned. Chapter 14. Christian Names and Surnames. The best method of treatment as regards the Christian names borne by the people during this period is to give a list of the more common names. Now there is a list ready to hand giving the names, Christian and surname, of Cade's Kentish followers. The whole number of men on the list amounts to 1719. I have gone through the list and transcribed the Christian names. The following is the result, classified according to frequency. The names present themselves to us rather unexpectedly. Thus, we have them as follows. John 546, Andrew each 2. William 277, Benedict. Thomas 233, Augustine. Richard 196, Salmon. Robert 115, Herman. Henry 53. Nicholas and Stephen each 37. Alexander each 1. Alexius. Roger 33, Christopher. Simon 22, David. Lawrence 21, Gerard. Peter and Walter each 17, Marcus. Lodowick. James 15, Vincentius. Ralph 12, Valentine. Hugh 8, Goodman. Adam 7, Gilbert. Philip 6, Daniel. Alan each 5, Waldus. Elias Clement. Dionysius Sampson. George. Galfrid. Tamu. Guy each 3. Bernard. Bartholomew. Michael. It will be seen that there are only 48 names in all. 1/3 of the men are named John, 1/6 William, 1/7 Thomas, 1/8 Richard, 1/15 Robert, 1/30 Henry, and that more than 30 out of the 48 names are used less than 6 times each. 2/3 of the people are called either John, William, Thomas, Richard, or Robert. And 373 all the Saxon names except one are clean gone and forgotten. Not one Alfred, Edward, Ethelred among them all. Here, again, is another list containing the names of 130 men. They come out in the following order. John 34, Henry 8, Nicholas 4. William 17, Roger 5, Walter 3. Thomas 15, Adam 5, Alexander 2. Richard 10, Stephen 3, Simon 2. Robert 8, Geoffrey 3. And once, Lawrence, James, Peter, Godfrey, Alan, Giles, Gilbert, Andrew, Reynard. Here, too, Saxon names have gone quite out of use. Among the names of women we find Johanna or Joan very common. Also frequently met with are the names of Isabel, Matilda, Alison, Lucy, Petronilla, Parnell, Agnes, Idonia, Avica, Illicoda, Rickelda, Ecoda, Clarissa, Arabella, Theophania, Tiffany, Masanda, Desiderata, Phinia, Massilia, Oncilia, Gaudieva. As regards the women's names, I have taken them from the calendar of wills and arranged them in alphabetical order. It will be observed that though Saxon Christian names have entirely died out among men, many are preserved among women. It will also be observed that many beautiful names have been lost to us, though they might very well be revived. In spelling there are varieties, of which a few are here marked. Adri collecta Helen Mary. Audrey Collet Helen Masha. Coletta Heliwissa Massilia. Agata Constance Hester Matilda. Agatha Crana Hilda Maudlin. Agnes Christina Hodirna Maudline. Alana Custance Maud. Albreda Ibota Mazerb. Albrica denies Ida Melina. Alditha Dionisia Idania Millicent. Alesia Dionisia Idonia Milsenda. Alienora Diamanda Emania Muriel. Alice Dorks Isabella. Alium Dulce Isolda Olive. Alesia Isaud Orbilia. Aluja Iralda Isan Osi. Alveva Edis. Amabilia Edith Jacobina Pavia. Amia Egidia Jacomine Pernella. Amy Edelina Jane Petronilla. Eleonora Janet Philippa. Amisha Elena Joan. Amisha Alicia Johan Reina. Annabilla Elizabeth Johannetta Reina. Ainbla M. Johanna Rebecca. Anastasia Emma Joyce Rickelda. Anna Imota Joette Roberga. Annie's Ermina Juta Roja. Anselina Erniberga Juliana Roja. Anselina Isabella Julian Roja. Argentilla Estrilda Judith Rosa. Atheline Ethildreda Rose. Oncilla Eustacia Castagna Rosamund. Oncilia Eve Catherine. Andrina Sabina. Avelina Felicia Laurentia Sabine. Avis Filiette Licia Salerna. Florence Lycia Sandrissa. Barbara Floria Lecia Sarah. Basilia Floricia Letitia Scholastica. Beatrice Frechasanchi Lenoda Sinicla. Beatrix Fridiswita Laura Cecilia. Bersabe Francis Loretta Sybil. Blanche Lucibetta Sita. Bona Gina Luseki Susanna. Bonioya Genselina Lucy Susan. Bridget Genora Luma Swanalda. Goda Lydia. Cassandra Godleva Thomasina. Castania Gonalda Mabel Thomason. Cecily Grace Magoda Thefania. Cecilia Gracia Marjorie Tefania. Charity Gunalda Margaret Theophany. Chira Gunora Marion. Cicely Mariona Wilhelma. Clarice Hannah Marsilia Winmarka. Clarisha Hawija Massilia Wiley Holte. Clemens Hoysa Martha. I have also drawn up a list of surnames belonging to London citizens in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Such a list very properly belongs to the history of London. It may be analyzed by any who desire to investigate the origins of names. For the purpose of this work, I have found it to be sufficient to take the analysis made by Riley for his Memorials of London and London Life. It is in substance as follows. The surname of the native country, William Whaleys; the Welshman, Walter Norreys; the Norwegian, John Francis; the Frenchman. The surname of the native town. Riley found nearly every town and village of England represented in the London names. The surname taken from the position of the man's residence, as Hugh de Stone Crouch, Hugh near the Stone Cross of Cheapside, Jonatas Strand in the Strand, Ralph de Hunelane. From the sign of a house, hence the class of names such as Gander, Buck, Hind, etc. From the trade of the man or that of his father or his ancestor. All such names as brewer, baker, smith, etc. belong to this class. The name of Chaucer, shoemaker, came to the poet from his grandfather presumably, as his father was not a shoemaker. From a nickname, descriptive or sobriquet. Among these Riley enumerates bon valet, godgrum, goodgroom, cashmark, hide halfpenny, piggus flesh, brokdeshay, black in the mouth, weathercock, spillwine, galilali. The learned editor of the Memorials very justly argues that at that time, most men had no need of a surname. If a man were poor, he would never have to sign any document at all during the whole of his life. If he were a servant or a craftsman, a Christian name would be quite enough for him. As, at the present day, we may have servants in the house without knowing their surnames at all. And among the better sort a Christian name, with something to distinguish the holder from others with the same Christian name, would be quite enough. By the 14th century, the old names of the ancient city families have quite died out. These were Alger, Hacken, Thovey, Lotering, Bucarol, Aswai, Basing, Anquetil, Blount, Bat, Frowick, Hervey, Vial, Harvel, Alin, Hartle, and others. Some of these families became extinct, some withdrew into the country, some, perhaps, lost their wealth and sank down into the mass of the people. As an illustration of these divisions, let us take a string of names consecutively from the index to the calendar of wills, Part I, 1288-1358, 376 Fernell. Fulbert Finchingfeld Garchurch, Fulhams Fingry Garthorpe, Fulk Garten, Fuller Gaytone Gatestein, Fulsham Galeys Gaugiar, Funder Galacher Gaunt, Ferber Gamelin Gaunter, Firmiger Ganter Gautrone, Furnival Garchorp Jettlestone, Fusidame Gardrobe Jeffrey, Fuster Gardener Jean, Finch Garlon Gentle, Fineyham Garlickmonger Gentleman. Of these names, 39 in all, 14 belong to trades, 15 belong to places, 3 express a qualification or condition, 3 are Christian names. The name Gamelin suggests Chaucer's Cook's Tale of Gamelin. In another place, this occurs as a Christian name. Furnival reminds us that as early as the reign of Henry Roman IV, the inn once belonged to the Lords Furnival, and their townhouse had become an inn of chancery. The name of Finch appears from Riley's Memorials, p. 229, to have belonged to Winchelsea. The Galacher was a maker of galaches, which were shoes with wooden soles. The name of Jean may have referred to Genoa. Fusidame and Gautron are beyond me. See also Appendix Roman 9.